And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. It's a fantastic crowd with us already tonight. Of course, as usual, I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And we have so many great things to cover tonight. This is X Series episode 94, and this gets us into clowns and clones. And what's interesting about this is when you go into Las Vegas and you find that aerospace connection, I called it Space Vegas. And anyone who's been watching our recent documentary got a hint that Las Vegas was at the heart of a lot of these things that we're talking about in terms of secret aerospace and that deep state assassination milieu. The documentary is called X Protect UFO File Assassins. I have the link in the description of this video. And going forward, we're at X Series episode 94. Going forward now, I would say that the documentary is sort of required viewing if you haven't already, and so many have written to me about it. But it informs so much of the background materials condensed down that the whole history of the X series will get you there, and I'm going to explain a few things about X. I know we've had a lot of weird political things going on. It's truly dreadful.
Weird is an understatement.
And for me, it's the typical ping pong match and VP this, and there'll be all these things saying how great the new VP is, and there's a lot of hit pieces out on her because she already ran before and didn't attract a whole lot of attention the first time.
I think it was, 2%?
Yeah, pretty weak, and also the Democrats have California, so it's an odd choice in that sense. But they're looking for a certain type of progressive image, and the idea that they would choose a woman of color is supposed to give them that. But unfortunately, at the top of the ticket, they have this person, Biden. He's not there. He's not with it. And they seem to be able to supercharge him for 30 to 60 seconds at a time. And then he wanders off, literally. So they're in trouble there, regardless of how they're trying to cushion that. And I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if they have Nancy Pelosi step in.
I think with mail-in voting, they can do what they want.
It's true. And but it does look also like the Trump campaign, they have a lot of things working on their side now. And there's a lot of things breaking that are going on in relation to the Russian collusion investigation. A lot of those FBI people who were trying to take sides, which they're not supposed to do politically, and that they were really creating these scenarios to ice Trump, who was the guy that they just wanted to get out of there. And like him or not, the FBI and the CIA don't have that kind of a role. And so now today's strangest development is that, we have Millennial Millie over at InfoWars, who really does good reports. And
she's got guts.
She does. And, coming in really to that whole political scene, and the InfoWars stuff is wild enough as it is, but she did her own documentary and went to put it out, and it was all about this kind of Russia collusion thing, and she had some whistleblowers and stuff, and so she got arrested today at her home. There's a video out about that, and I think everyone needs to pay attention to this case because they've been doing this figuratively online by putting people in Twitter jail or shadow banning people. Now they're moving into the real thing. And we're going to see this a lot more. If you really look at the stats and you go in there, you're going to see what took place in 2016 largely was driven by the alternative media, because the alternative media exposed so many of these different topics, and WikiLeaks and all the rest of it. And that those controllers who really want to move in and control the narrative from here to there, they haven't figured out how to do it. They've tried different things. We'll just shut off this person on Twitter. It doesn't matter if they have 1 million followers or not. Completely undemocratic setup with Facebook and Twitter. They just have not figured out how to snuff out the mechanism entirely. So what they've done now is moved to this physical takeover thing. You're going to be grabbed by the thought police and put in jail if you come forward with these ideas. And we've witnessed, this kind of intimidation all around when you're getting into independent media and independent reporting. You don't see it on the mainstream stage so much because the mainstream stage, they can't really do much, but alternative media tends to be more of a Wild West, and there's good and bad aspects to that. But the best part of it is that we'll be able to deliver in that space more actual truth. But this latest development, let's face it, this is straight up kind of fascist tactic trying to shut down the kind of media opposition. So this is going to be very important, and we have to hope that anyone who's in that position, like Millie gets a lot of support, and that people really pay attention to why they're grabbing this person who's making a documentary. What kind of a chilling message are they trying to send? We remember the case of Cheryl Atkinson when she was at CBS News. And, the Obama administration didn't even mess around. They hacked directly into her laptop to get info because she was looking into how basically, a number of things that were wrong over there at the State Department for Obama. And there was a lot. There's a lot of corruption going on during his terms. But I think one of the things that we had with Cheryl Atkinson in that case was somebody who was a mainstream version of this. And then they were trying to intimidate her. And finally, they came out with that report that they were going to use the Espionage Act on her. And this is really interesting because it hadn't been used really actively until, since 1917, something along that line. And so Obama pulled out these draconian things to try to shut down any of that dissent. So this is a very important thing for us to keep an eye on, and we will going forward. But we can see, we've been talking a while about the space and how they just throw off who they don't like. That is the measure of these social media platforms. Now we're trying to, make them as news friendly for real news as possible. But certainly if you go into an area that they don't like, and we've experienced it ourselves, they will make it very difficult for you. So what I always recommend in our case is you go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter, because that gives us that direct pipeline and we don't have to deal with an intermediary or a middleman until they start shutting websites down. That'll be, I can picture that too. So that's something to keep in mind. So take a moment to do that. It's a free newsletter, and it keeps you and I on the same page. Basically just lets you know what shows will be coming up. Now tonight, we're going to be delving deeply into this track between where Howard Hughes and the black budget development of space left off, and where we have things that have been building up on the black ops side over 50 years between, say, the mid 70s and this period that we're rolling into, where they're talking about, hey, we're going to the moon in 2024, and we have the Space Force, and, the Pentagon wants to talk about UFOs, and Lou, and, the whole TTSA gang. This whole wave of stuff comes out of nowhere, just as we're getting around this period of time where they've done with this black development. But where did that black development come from? Well, so much of it, as we described in the documentary, came through Hughes Aerospace. And Hughes Aerospace became the major driver for other companies like Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman, which actually grabbed most of the assets of Litton Industries and Hughes. But Hughes, it turns out that a couple of the key things from Hughes Aerospace, one of them is DirecTV. That's still very active with us from this great satellite work that he put up there. And the other is L3 Electronics. They grab so much of that. Now, what a lot of people don't know is that the Howard Hughes Corporation is still very active, as is the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, and over a dozen entities that he left behind. Now, where he left off controlling them, and where the CIA and other groups like the Mormons came in and took over, that's always been really very interesting. But remember, too, that the Mormons have a great space interest. Is what is going to bring us into Las Vegas. And how does Las Vegas get to be Space Vegas? I'm going to go through that with you. Let's start with Elon Musk here in this regard. The first thing we need to do, since the show is the X-Steganography series, we've been talking about how the advanced technology takes on the letter X as its signature. And that is a signature in steganography, which the people watching it know what it is, but the people who aren't watching it, even though it's out in the open, they can see it. They don't know what it means, so they just pass it by. So steganography takes on many different forms. A lot of people pay attention to image steganography, software, all these different types of things. The type of steganography, you can really take this all the way back to what they used to do to kind of smuggle things out of churches and stuff. They would develop all types of codes to put in these books to get them out, and the person who would get them would understand what they meant. So the difference between, say, something like cryptography and steganography is interesting, because cryptography, very often you could see that there was a puzzle there and people would spend all this time trying to crack it. With steganography, you would think that you were just looking at the most normal thing in the world, like a logo. And then this is the type of thing that communicates. So a real kind of easy example when thinking about steganography, and I think this is important for us going into this, when we think about X-steganography, imagine that you're the head of the Central Intelligence Agency and you've got to brief 8,000 people to track a particular thing, but you can't trust all of those 8,000 people with the crucial details around the thing you want to track. So what you do is you come up with a naming system that allows them to know that there's a secret project there that needs to move through this agency or that agency, so therefore it can't go through the normal scrutiny, but you don't tell them the real background of what that is. So you don't have to sit there and brief 8,000 agents on this very crucial national security, world security detail, or whatever kind of secret that you're trying to maintain for industry or defense contractors. So when you get something like X-steganography, it's interesting because you've solved that problem. And X-steganography actually goes very far back, and I think the person who used it in the 20th century that got us using it around things like aerospace projects was scientist Vannevar Bush, who worked for FDR and Truman and Eisenhower, and was the head of the Office of Science Development, the R&D of America, basically, during World War II. But he was someone who had founded the MIT Masonic Lodge, which is only about 10 minutes from here. And that level of secrecy that he, as the Grand Master of that lodge, would have been privy to and understood codes and understood things as they related to ancient teachings would be very important. So when we think about X-steganography, that use of it in these projects, in these secret aerospace projects going forward, even the X files that were developed to track UFOs, that's all the same X-steganography. So when we get our heads wrapped around that, I think we get a kind of a snapshot. Now it goes much further back, which is why it's the Masonic tie-in that probably tapped into that X part, because that goes back to Pythagoras and takes you back to the Egyptian Book of the Dead, where they were using X-steganography to also hide advanced projects, not our kind of advanced projects, but their kind. So you'll see over and over again that the people who are utilizing that X-steganography have to signal to each other. Now, here in episode 94 of the X series, with over 200 examples of the X-steganography, it's not a lark. It's not just a theory put forward. It's obviously out there. Anybody can test this. And we've provided in the shows so many of those different projects. Yes, I come to my own conclusion about what they're doing with it, but they're definitely using it. So here's a couple of quick examples. I often cite this one from Jeff Bezos, and this is about Blue Origin, which is his space venture, being the richest man in the world. And there he is pictured with his X-steganography. In the case of SpaceX, it's embedded in the logo. And of course, one of the things that we know about our friend Elon Musk is that his company was X.com. This is what he created, and it was going to be the ultimate finance company. And then PayPal came along and said, we can move this along a lot quicker. Plus, maybe they were thinking that X-steganography and the money thing, that's going to be really tricky. So please stick to aerospace. This is something worth considering. now what we're moving into, and this happened in May, so this is just how recent this is. The way of the future, Howard Hughes Company is pitching Elon Musk on a Vegas Tesla headquarters. Now here's the Hughes Tesla combination. A lot of people in the media suggested, even before these developments hit, that these people had a lot in common. That is, Hughes and Tesla. They were both geniuses with access to huge amounts of money, and they both were deeply involved in technological and aerospace ventures. And this, I think, becomes very important because I think that what they're doing, when we think about somebody like Elon Musk, when you have someone well situated at the head of, as CEO, dealing with electric cars, and I'm going to show tonight how he's in charge of a gigantic underground tunneling network industry company. And I'm going to show, when we look at SpaceX, he's talking about colonizing Mars. Well, you usually don't have somebody involved in all of those different facets. They're really trying to consolidate quite a bit in the case of Musk. So the fact that the Howard Hughes organization reached out to him is, it's that identification factor. It gives us that signal. And the fact that they all are sort of deeply involved in that X-steganography. One of the things I also want to point out in relation to Musk is that in terms of the Las Vegas aspect of him now saying, I'm moving my operations to Las Vegas. I'm moving everything to Nevada because California is locking people down. We can't work there. That's a good reason. But why Nevada? And why the Hughes part? You're going to find, when you look deeply into this, as I have, that almost anything important comes out of Las Vegas, which is a very hard thing for us to sit and wrap our minds around. Well, certainly Nevada, but Las Vegas is kind of like that capital. It's like the Washington, D.C. of the whole thing. You've got the advanced aerospace coming out of there. You had atomic weaponry coming out of there. You had the massive mafia, gambling runoff out of there. We have incredible industry around Nevada. And now we're seeing right in the heart of all this that very openly somebody like Musk needs to move his entire operation in order to identify with this kind of underground national security state. We know they have the greatest underground facilities there as well because they tested nuclear weapons there since 1945. And so we're looking at something in the case of Nevada, which is kind of an entity unto itself. So when we look at people like Harry Reid coming out, for example, and supporting this Lou Elizondo idea about UFOs and disclosure, and him saying, oh, I'm so great on disclosure. Well, Harry Reid was the senator and Senate Majority Leader over all that secrecy at Area 51. And he never did anything about it while he was in power. Nothing. And he also, instead of being a transparency king, voted against an audit of the Federal Reserve, not once, not twice, but 12 times. So that's not somebody who's interested in any kind of transparency. And this is very important when you get into these areas because these people like to remake themselves as champions and heroes of disclosure. But when we go even a little bit deeper into their record, it's a totally different thing. I'm sure you can get that. Mm-hmm. So we're going to get deep into Musk here, but before we go any further, Miss Olivia, how you doing out there?
Doing great. Ed Kaufman says, could we say that X-steganography is a simpler way for a fifth column within the UFO file network to communicate with each other?
Yes, it is. The X technology resides inside the UFO file. So we have to consider that. There's something about when you get around the UFO file, that level of secrecy matches the X technology. And so we say to ourselves, is it the same thing? Is X technology UFO technology? Or is it merely that they're on the same level? Because certainly the Tesla technology also takes on qualities of the X technology. I mean, this is what they've been hiding. When you go further back and you look at things like theosophy, and we looked at inventors like John Keeley, who were contemporaneous with Tesla, he, according to reports back then, was flying planes that could go 500 miles an hour. That's 1899. So then you get the very primitive kind of Wright brothers thing. And it's fun to think of it like that. But really what's actually happening is what he's demonstrating for the military and so on is very advanced stuff. So then you say, where did that go? And, on this program, we've tracked that story about how it went to the Theosophical Society. That's where they shipped it out once he died as he was bringing this forward. And it was quite remarkable, too, because his partner, they were after him, too. And he had to go. It was right here in Boston that all this happened. He had to ship this out to, all of the blueprints and everything else. He had to ship out to England. And it was Annie Besant who was on the receiving end of all that. And then Theosophy took a look at it and said, these people are going to be dropping bombs and everything else on each other. We can't give them this too. So we're going to put it underground until the culture grows up a little bit. So we see that, there's different ways of hiding things. And mystery schools also have kind of a merit system about learning things. But what happened is a kind of an immoral group, a lot of the corporate raiders, decided to use the similar type tactic, but they didn't decide to grow ethically themselves. They just used the secrecy to keep the thing secret without any of the kind of ethical, spiritual background of the mystery schools. So we have a very interesting situation when you look at that. Now, it came up that Musk had started to tweet that aliens had built the pyramids. I thought this was pretty good.
When did this happen?
It was only about a week ago.
Wow.
And the Egyptian government, who he's built satellites for and stuff, said, no, Egyptians built the pyramids. I mean, in a sense, true. I mean, with Atlantean knowledge, yes. But, when you look at that whole UFO aspect and people understand that, the Eric von Daniken kind of ancient aliens idea, before it got exploited through the History Channel, you get a handle on that. People understand there may have been something very advanced technologically happening, and they can't ascribe it to anything else. So they instantly go to, well, it must have been aliens coming here and visiting. But the idea that there was an advanced culture back there is starting, that's the thing that we're starting to really open up to. And that's going to be, in a sense, a bigger disclosure that is more at our grasp, because on some level, the UFO thing is always going to be a little bit out of our reach. Coming from a different dimension and everything else. So everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 94. We're going deep now on clowns and clones. And this is the Space Vegas, not Las Vegas. Well, Las Vegas is in there, but it's Space Vegas. And it is bringing up that SpaceX Hughes mystery into Nevada and into Las Vegas. And when you get into some of the players, I'm going to get really into the nitty gritty with some of the political players around this whole aerospace rush. And we're going to learn that so much of the government, the operating functional government that we see, is in the middle of this situation. So it's quite remarkable. Well, I just showed you Elon Musk and his kind of interesting Egyptian tweet. Down there in Las Vegas, if you go, and I used to have to go every year because I would go for the Consumer Electronics Show, which is it's the biggest electronics show. And when you go into Las Vegas, you will inevitably be impressed with the layout. But one of the things you'll see that's very unusual is all this Egyptian imagery. You'll see Sphinx pyramids, black pyramids, granite pyramids, and things like this that they have at the Luxor Hotel, adopting really heavy duty, in some cases going so far as to imitate things like Cleopatra's Needle. And the Luxor has a very interesting history. The Luxor and the Landmark both had a lot in common with Hughes, although the Luxor came later. And in the case of the Landmark, which we won't get into too much tonight because it's off topic, but Howard Hughes said, I want this entire hotel complex to look like the ancient Incan kingdom. So they set it up with all this Inca stuff. And then he was like, no, I've decided I want it to be space age. I want it to have the Space Needle in there. And then so they turned it into the Space Needle. He's like, well, I still miss some of the Inca stuff. So it was half Space Needle and half Inca. And this is the nature of him really, tapping in whatever it is he was into. But then others followed suit, and you're going to find that those kind of nods to the mysteries that we find replete throughout Las Vegas and some of the biggest and baddest of the resorts and everything else, that Egyptian imagery is used very, very heavily. And some people could say it's just a lark, but we're going to consider it from a point of view that this is part of the understanding that these people have, that they are kind of playing out an occult side of what they understand about ancient knowledge in ancient Egypt. Now, SpaceX got very connected with this. This is something that they set up. They toyed a lot with Egyptian imagery, so much so that they created a company which was all about building, digging through underground tunnels. And we're going to get into that company and how very unusual it is and how it relates to all this. But one of the things that they did is they made all of these kits that were like Lego kits, and they were all ancient Egyptian themed. And all they could do was talk about, we're going to have the best, kind of most kick-ass ancient Egyptian Lego kits. So there's always this SpaceX Egyptian thing somehow in the mix of all this. And it's going to make sense as we go along here why that's happening.
A cult fan is bringing up the idea that Vegas is a Stargate.
Well, I think whoever put that city there on the map, as we find out, Bugsy Siegel and people like that, but really the forces behind all that must have understood that, it has to be in that realm of possibilities. And it has to be just by the nature of that. It's one of those things like New York. You just understand that there's something special that's happening there. It's a disaster now because it's been screwed up by the government. But in truth, just like these other places, there's so many of them. And Las Vegas would have to qualify as a very good candidate on that front. But let's keep taking a look at Google and how Google now comes into some of this, and how this imagery that they're using from SpaceX into Egypt, now we're going to bring Google into this. And when we're done, we're going to find that we are face to face with X-Steganography, SpaceX, Google, and Howard Hughes. And we're going to have to figure out how that all fits together. And we're going to do it before the clock rings thrice. And I want to remind everyone we're going to take questions in the second half of the program. So you can ask them all in caps, and we'll take all those questions. Olivia will put those together. It seems like a very busy crowd in the ideas room tonight. I can already see a lot of very familiar faces and good questions. So we're going to be tackling a lot of those tonight. In the little connections of Hughes, now we've gone Hughes, SpaceX. Let's go Hughes, Google for a minute. Something kind of odd happened fairly recently, which is that Google moved the headquarters for YouTube, which actually means that in some sense, I'm coming to you live from Hughes Spruce Goose hangar. Even though I'm beaming from Cambridge, that signal is coming right out of YouTube headquarters. And that YouTube headquarters signal is right there in Playa Vista. Now, this came up, this was the first rumblings around it, about 2014. Google buying hangar where the Spruce Goose was built. But why? This becomes a very interesting question. And then it says, Google may be getting some new digs in Los Angeles. A massive hangar once owned by Howard Hughes is reportedly being eyed by Google. People familiar with the discussion say Google is close to inking a deal to buy the oddball facility. That's one way to put it. Now, the Spruce Goose we've covered on this program, and it's in the documentary, but of course it's Howard Hughes' most unusual project. And it is in fact the largest plane ever built in terms of wingspan, not in terms of mass, but it is gigantic. And we have a lot of great pictures about it. The Spruce Goose, 6 times larger than any aircraft of its time, was made almost entirely of birch. They said, maybe there was a wartime shortage and they they didn't use metal because of that. No, Hughes could get his hands on anything. So, and if he was building something for the government, they'd be giving him that stuff. They made this out of birch for some special reason. Now, until Hughes' death in 76, this is on the official record, a crew maintained the aircraft in flying condition in a climate-controlled hangar. That year, Hughes's Summa Corporation, which is very important, they're the ones who inherited everything for the most part after. They're a very unusual group that sort of grew up very late in the 60s with Hughes and became part of the wing that took over after his death. They gifted the plane, to the Aero Club of Southern California. Now, the hangar that we were talking about a moment ago that Google had the plane in cost $275 million. Can you have any idea what the cost of the plane that was built there is? I mean, so you can't, if you go gifting that to somebody, it's like, hey, here's $300 million, don't worry about it. So gifting it becomes a very interesting phrase. So the Aero Club leased it to Rather Corporation. It was kept in a large dome, and the Walt Disney Company acquired it, and they had it, and they did this whole dome display with the Spruce Goose. So there's a lot of imagery around the Spruce Goose, which was originally designed in 1947. So keep that in mind. And it was flown for the first and only time November 2nd, 1947. It was basically a flying boat. Huge. But there's always been a lot of mystery around it. There were congressional hearings at the time about it. People didn't understand what it was. And I believe that Hughes was about to introduce a very advanced X-style technology in the plane. And I think at a certain point, the U.S. government said, or the faction that was controlling the Hughes access to the government said, look, fly that thing once so we get you out of hot water because you're getting all this heat about taking these defense contracts and not having anything to show for it. But we can't have that thing out there, and we can't have the X technology out there. Fly it once and then lock it up, which is basically what happened. And he moved directly from 47 to 48. He created Hughes Aerospace. So he's a very early adopter on that front. So when we look at this, we're going to find out that the Spruce Goose becomes, this emblematic, and we're going to say about where it went as well, but it has that great emblematic sense of the mystery technology. Next up is Google buys the Spruce Goose hangar and they move the YouTube headquarters into it, which is why I said I'm beaming you directly from the hangar. Well, at the center of the hangar, kind of like a massive sundial in the middle of all this structure, we've got this very interesting sundial display description. Now, as a design element, it's just nice, to look at, and Google has that reputation, and it's a great layout. I have a lot of interesting pictures of it here. But some of the places referenced around it, kind of like a zodiac, are quite interesting. Let's start off with the first one, Antarctica. And they list how many miles they are away from it. That was the first one that grabbed me. But the second one is pretty damn strange, Easter Island. I mean, let's think about why Google is interested in Easter Island anyway. Then they go ahead and list how many miles away they are from Easter Island, 4,263, according to this map. Then they list LAX. Okay. Next one up, Uluru. Now, we know where this is, kind of like Australian outback, but really you're pointing at Pine Gap. So Pine Gap being Australia's version of Area 51. And we've done some shows on Pine Gap. When you go deep there, that's where some very heavy-duty UFO redevelopment has taken place. And it's really, you can get away with stuff, like I say with Autech in the ocean, you can get away with stuff there. I mean, you can get away with some things in the desert, but I think in terms of radar and everything else, you have a better shot at getting away with things in Australia. And you're far from the prying eyes of the Americans. Now, Google Singapore's on there, Mount Everest, Venice Beach, Googleplex, the Getty, which is only 7.8 miles away. So this almost becomes like an esoteric chessboard of some kind. Death Valley. And then right here, between the Getty and Death Valley, Spruce Goose, they listed 815 miles away. Then Griffith Observatory, and finally Cloud Gate. Cloud Gate is that very interesting structure. It looks like a metal egg that's in Chicago. And the strange thing is, as soon as I discovered this, everywhere I go, I've been seeing this references to Cloud Gate. But right there, you can see in the middle, it says, welcome to the Goose. And they call this Google Goose. I kid you not. And if you go deep into it, you're going to find that YouTube logo and those YouTube studios all over this place. Now, so we're getting here that the Spruce Goose connection in with Google, and then we were looking there and we found the Howard Hughes connection with SpaceX. So let's bring these things in and bring them around a little bit. That's where the facility is, by the way. And I pointed out this huge X that takes place where Litton Industries was. But over here, that's Playa Vista. And just to give you some orientation. Okay. So when we're thinking a lot about what the messaging is there, for Google, Google also has an incredibly deep interest in space. And, trust you, when we look at it, you're going to be looking at Google Space, inevitably. They talk about satellites, Google Earth, everything else. They're so locked in with that Google Space is just kind of a given. Let's look now at why and who may be behind some of the space aspects with Google. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is episode X-94. We're going to go deep on X-steganography here in relation to Howard Hughes, Elon Musk, and SpaceX, and also in terms of Google and how these projects are all interrelating and are going to find themselves staring right at Las Vegas as the kind of center point of all this activity. Now, sometimes the job of finding X-steganography in advanced projects is damn easy. In the case of Elon Musk, when he had X.com and then called his company SpaceX, signaling he was worthy and willing to work with that technology, it's pretty easy. In the case of Google X, or now just X, or Alphabet X, which is the parent company, now call themselves Alphabet, then they called Google was Google X, and now it's X. It's very interesting, but nonetheless, regardless what they call themselves, there they are. X. Now, X is the main part of Google's sort of brain trust. And they bring together some of the best minds to put together these problems. And then they create these different scenarios, not necessarily, according to them, with an outcome in mind, just to play the scenario out. It's giving a lot of wiggle room. This is the person in charge. His name is Astro Teller. Astro's a very interesting guy. He finds himself at the top of this chain of the X-steganography for Google. There he is. And so there was some articles done on him in Fast Company and others. Let's see which one. I'm going to use the one from GeekWire. But Astro Teller, they call him the captain of moonshots at Alphabet's X-Idea Factory. He shows off two of X's innovations. Google's self-driving car, that's an X innovation. So now these people, when it gets to space, when it gets to the underground, you're just, basically the X technology is out in the open. It's not even hidden anymore, but they're communicating more openly with it. They still don't know that we know what it is, but they certainly do. Now, people who watch this program understand what it is, and it starts to create a very interesting situation, because then we actually start to see them reacting to things that we, not just the show, but we as a collective, people in the ideas room, people watch, and exchange these ideas, we start to see this as kind of like an interesting back and forth. There were strange things like Madonna's tour last year that was all about Madam X and all the rest of it. People reference it. They can be underneath it. They can understand that it's out there in a thing, and they reference it. They don't have to be in the boardroom for X technology or X steganography. They're groups, think of them, especially on the aerospace side, as elite groups that use it for messaging. But it's sort of a long arc of using it. And so they have all these examples. And so when they use it, they signal to each other that they are in the know about this. It helps them communicate easier, but they don't have to sit down and say, well, I have the X technology and here's my next interview on it. They just do the stuff, and that way it represents to the other one, oh, you're doing that with X? Well, I just put somebody on Mars with X. So it gives us that kind of thing. But in his case, you might have heard about this projects where they're hanging these balloons over areas that don't usually get the internet. So in Thailand, I'm going to hang some balloons over there and make sure you get the internet. And so, we can look at that as we're bringing the internet to you, or rather we're bringing you to the internet so that we can make sure that we control you. This is another way to kind of look at it. But there's a few interesting quotes in here, so I'm going to read from the article a little bit. By the way, he comes to work every day in rollerblades, which I think is kind of interesting. I tried that for a while, but it didn't work out so great. The inline skates help Teller, the captain who's at the helm of what's known as X, the moonshot factory. And the web address is x.company. Get between appointments in the 500,000 square foot complex more quickly. Yeah, I guess it would help you. I think this is about 500,000 square inches all the way around. But today's rapid pace of innovation and competition is increasing in pressure to turn to blue sky ideas into marketable projects. So X's aim is to systemize the process of picking winning technologies. You might remember that there's the Google X Prize out there for the best idea. And somebody with X Prize money from Israel shot something up like a moon crawler up there. So, these things are having their impact. What I find so interesting is when they talk a little further, they say, from the outside, X's spot looks more like your typical suburban corporate campus than a factory in the 20th century sense of the word. The facility started out in the 60s as Mountain View's Mayfield Mall, the first air-conditioned enclosed shopping center in Northern California. When X took over the property in 2015, it gave the facility an open girder, high-tech industrial look, bare concrete floors. And, it's interesting. It created this atmosphere. But here they were moving in and taking over these different locations. Something happened in that period around 2014, 2015, where they started to move in not only to these malls and other areas, but to move into former airport hangars. And this is going to become very interesting. It has some really interesting examples about this. One of the things that we have to get to, though, is that name Astro Teller. Is that name Teller ringing a bell for any of you in the audience? Well, it should, because the person who designed the hydrogen bomb and was kind of the Darth Vader around all our nuclear projects was Edward Teller, who's also deeply involved in the UFO file and in the setting up of SDI's Star Wars for Reagan in the 80s, but certainly he made his bones more in the 40s and 50s. That's his grandson. So an incredible access to that brain trust that Teller had. But now let's bring that back to a weird story. The weird story is, we know all about the Bob Lazar story, which came out, and then we had, people like George Knapp promoting Lazar. Now, Lazar's story has always been very controversial, and it came out in '89 and '90, saying that he had been at Area 51 and seen these UFOs and stuff. Now, it's a fact that some of that stuff was very edgy when it first came out. So, one or two things is true. It was a genuine whistleblower, or someone inside there wanted to get some information out. And, guys like Knapp pat themselves on the back about that story. And I would say this, that it's a heck of a better story than TTSA has. But still, there are problems with it. Lazar lied about his education. He lied about going to MIT and things of this nature. And, so you have people like Knapp and, that go on Joe Rogan and things like that with the filmmaker guy, I forget his name. And they take like a victory lap, like, see, Lazar was right, and all the rest of it. But it doesn't work that way. That story is still strange for a lot of reasons. There's a lot of misinformation mixed in with it, even if it is a step forward in a sense. So we have to kind of look at it that way. But oddly enough, Lazar, the person that he's claimed got him the recommendation to work at S4 was Edward Teller, who he said took an interest in his work. This to me is very interesting for a lot of reasons, because Edward Teller had worked very deeply and was very paranoid, and everything. All of his thoughts were about, how we can bomb the other country without them getting a shot back at us. So when he turns his attentions to the UFO file, he starts to think of them as an enemy and a threat and all those types of things. So the people that he wants to develop projects may be people that would be kind of disposable and easy to discredit, etc., which may give some credence in a way to Lazar's story. But nonetheless, it's very interesting to consider that mix. Now let's consider another one. I pointed out Harry Reid already as being the senator from Las Vegas, Nevada, and he also, he's a Mormon, and he also became the Senate Majority Leader for years and years and years, never moved anything forward on the UFO front, and then after the fact became this weird kind of back-end hero in the New York Times story because he was willing to talk about UFOs suddenly. But the person who's out there with him was Bob Bigelow. And Bob Bigelow has Bigelow Aerospace. And it just seems to me, again, Bigelow is big on the UFO front. So far, he seems to be losing out on that thing to people like Branson and Musk, who have a much bigger presence in space. But he wanted to do these inflatable hotels in space and things like that. But again, all of this is coming out of Nevada. You can't get any way around it. The Area 51 story, Lazar, Edward Teller, Harry Reid, Bob Bigelow, we're always right back to Nevada again and again. And certainly, saying that we have a test facility in the desert gives us some of the answers for that. But the incredible pull now with Musk going there, Musk being a space company, but they're not going there to do space projects. What Elon Musk is taking his company into Las Vegas for is to do underground drilling. And he's already completed a couple of projects in that sense. So now it's an underground, overground kind of a thing. And really, you have to wonder if some of the space stuff isn't just a kind of a distraction or a buildup away from things that they are doing underground. And if we have already been building facilities underground through programs like COG to avoid nuclear attack and all the rest, and that became sort of an underground government, if we have those large-scale, deep underground military bases, how are they going to make those palatable? How are you going to take that entire infrastructure and say, we built this whole thing, we've been living down there, we've been hoarding all these missing trillions from the government. How do you kind of bring that into online to normal everyday reality? Well, you probably have this guy go in there with his company, which is called Boring. And that's because it bores deeply into the earth. And then he's going to create the scenario where, I've created all these tunnels. There's a gigantic underground metropolis. You're all set. So these are the types of things that we have to wrap our heads around on one end. And some people, when we think about Las Vegas, they might think about the mafia and gambling. All that is a function of how to bring in funds, how to sort of money launder and do black budget money laundering. That's all the aerospace companies think about it in terms of that sense. So that comes into what we're going to talk about as well, because there is a mafia aspect to this. But what I want to get our heads wrapped around is this is a multi-pronged operation. And we have to notice that it seems to all center over and over again around Las Vegas. Let's take a little bit further. And of course, that story, I mentioned Elizondo and TTSA and how Knapp assisted them in getting their op off the ground and saying, oh, I was such a sad CIA guy when all this was going on. And, I wanted UFO disclosure and all this. And, they didn't do any of the due diligence around Lou Elizondo. He was somebody who had been in the Pentagon, but the whole thing about his story, he was so heavy on misrepresentations. And then they didn't go into the idea that he was a counterintelligence agent and therefore would be prone to giving us the wrong information when thinking about this. So that whole operation, the TTSA part, bringing them online, again, it comes out of KLAS-TV. Well, it's interesting because KLAS-TV, which Knapp works for, was also what brought our friend Bob Lazar out. But KLAS-TV had an owner in the 1960s, and that owner was Howard Hughes. So, you start to get the impression here that you're always dealing with this pipeline coming through, whether it's messaging or whatever, and we're always getting this UFO story, and it's always coming out of Nevada, and it's always, somewhere in the background there's a Hughes piece, and now we have the Musk connection digging in with Hughes. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 94. We're going deep on clowns and clones and the Space Vegas, SpaceX, Hughes, and UFO mystery. We're going to be taking questions in the second half of the program, so you can ask them in caps. Miss Olivia is putting those together. Mm-hmm. What's going on out there?
Well, the question is, what is under the Spruce Goose hangar?
Wow. Well, I am going to give you such detail on the Spruce Goose hangar that it's going to shock the house. I guarantee you. Okay. And I am going to get into that. I'm not on that section yet, but I'm almost there because we have to get a little bit into Greenspun first. Mm-hmm. But I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com. That's a good question, by the way. And sign up for the newsletter. That's a way to keep us in touch with each other. We opened the program talking to you about Millennial Millie from InfoWars, who got grabbed by federal marshals today. And that story is a breaking story. But whenever we're around this milieu of independent reporting, we have to keep our eyes open when things like that happen, when people get grabbed, that's very Stasi type tactic. And so we have to definitely stay on top of what was happening there. You mentioned the Spruce Goose. I want to show this picture of Hughes aboard the Spruce Goose. Give you some idea of the man. Very technical oriented, incredible aviation genius, often portrayed just for his more unusual characteristics. One of the things we brought out in the documentary dealing with Hughes is his fascination for UFOs. Now, this is very interesting because we talked with Bruce Morgan, Bruce Ross Morgan, who's the son of the actress Yvonne DiCarlo. Is Bruce out there tonight?
Yes, he is.
Oh, fantastic. It's good to see you, Bruce. Just before we came on, he sent me this, actually, which is quite interesting. And this is 1949, A Year of New Horizons. What a shot of DiCarlo and then the Time magazine cover
Ba-ba-boom.
With Hughes. Right, exactly. But that is just that snapshot that in your mind. And if you've seen the documentary, the UFO File Assassins documentary that we put out at the end of July, it has a section there where Bruce Ross Morgan discusses how his mother dated Hughes. And one of the things that came up, which is quite interesting, is that Hughes wanted to show her basically something that was the equivalent of a UFO graveyard or a crash site. And I won't blow the end because it's in the documentary. But we have to keep in mind that when looking at Hughes, we're looking at someone who had great understanding and who was really seeking out with all of his billions the secret behind this X technology and actively developing it. He was surrounded by the very best people, and he had all those government contacts. He was the person, he was the go-to. And eventually the CIA went to him and said, you know, we can give you access to all these different things. Just let us use your company basically for all these black projects. And so a number of unusual things happened. For example, Nixon was vice president, and he'd been kind of handpicked by Hughes because Hughes wanted somebody who he could go to with legislative problems to open up this hotel or to take over this airfield or whatever it happened to be. And Nixon was the guy. But interestingly enough, with Nixon, Hughes gave him a $250,000 loan to his brother to open up this Nixon Burger fast food chain on the West Coast. And that money, and then later there's hints that he gave him $1 million, not to the brother, but directly to Nixon to help fund a campaign. And what Nixon did in return was he gave the ability for Hughes Aerospace, which was one of the few private space companies. We had, you know, we were going to develop NASA there in 1958. But the private side, there wasn't a lot that were going into space. This is something where he was really on the cutting edge. And his obsession with space was heavy duty. And what Nixon did was he took the money and he allowed Hughes to pass off Hughes Aerospace through Hughes Medical Foundation, which set up a structure where he didn't have to pay any taxes. It was all a tax-deductible charity, which gave him an incredible edge over all the other companies and allowed for vast black budget space project development. This is very crucial because when we look at all the things that have happened, when we look at companies like SpaceX, when we look at the programs on the space side going black for almost 50 years, you know, the last man that walked on the moon is 1972, and they want to tell us in 2024 somebody else might get up there and do it. Why would that be exciting? I mean, it's exciting to go to the moon, but it's 50 years later. What happened in between? If we wanted to go back to the moon, why did they miss 50 years? So whatever happens in that chasm is all the stuff that the Hughes organization in aerospace built up, which is why it's so important to crack the Hughes story, because it's been sitting there in the middle. The journalists of the time couldn't get at it, and they were satisfied to get Watergate story. And then shortly after that, Hughes died. And they just were satisfied with the story. Oh, he was eccentric, and he tried to buy power. So he tried to buy this guy and buy that guy, which is true. But of course, that story goes a lot deeper, because what was it that Hughes was after? Why build a Hughes Aerospace company? What was he looking to do? So this gets us more in the mind of the things that we need to be looking at. So so that when we take a look at somebody that they are molding in the same kind of pattern as Hughes. Remember, they're putting now Elon Musk in charge of Tesla, right? So we already have electric cars, and then on the SpaceX side, he's colonizing Mars. And now with boring, he's going underground. The next thing is there's this ancient Egyptian thing. Maybe he's going to be the ultimate archaeological guy. I mean, they can do anything they want with this guy. But I feel like, especially with the Hughes crossover, if we can understand Hughes, we're going to understand the platform of somebody like Elon Musk landing in the middle of this. Because really, Elon Musk was working for Compaq, you know, in the 90s. And there was nothing indicative. He didn't inherit a family fortune. You know, his dad's South African, his mom's Canadian. He's grew up most of his life in Canada. You know, there was nothing there that indicated this guy's going to be the fifth richest man in the world in the 90s. And, you know, there are pictures of him, and he is I point this out not to, you know, ruffle him personally, but he was bald, and he was kind of overweight, schlubbish software designer. And they just grabbed this guy, you know, they like put him on a superhero diet. They gave him hair, and they gave him all these wild ideas. And they said, go after this Nikola Tesla thing, you know, you're going to do that. And then say you want to go into space, you're going to be a rocket man and all the rest of it. And then when we go further and we look at someone like Wernher von Braun, who was the father of our space program, and was also, the head of the Nazi space program. He wrote a novel about the first colony on Mars, and the leader of the colony, his name was Elon. That's pretty, when you think about that, we have a lot of things out there in the public, and a lot of the messaging is full on there. So let's take a quick look at this. Now, what I want to do is just wrap our minds around how the Hughes thing and how Elon's thing is sort of similar. And then we're going to jump on the Spruce Goose. Before I leave the Google part, though, I want to show where that little sundial is, sitting in the middle of what was the Spruce Goose hangar.
God, it's so beautiful.
Isn't it remarkable?
Mm-hmm.
Still incredible. And like I said, it went for $270 million, so you can only imagine how much the plane is worth. One thing that has to be mentioned here, and one of the reasons that we mentioned clowns and clones, the clowns part is very interesting because the CIA is dripping all over these stories about aerospace and UFOs. So wherever you go in this, you're going to find what they call clowns in America, the CIA. We've done a lot of reporting on this. I do not think that, and I've always said this, the people who study the UFO side, they don't understand the track that they're looking at in terms of the deep state control of government. So the people who study deep state control, political systems, JFK assassination, things of this nature, they understand that background controlling aspect. When people go into the UFO side, I want to say that in a sense that they're a more shallow research crowd, that they don't go as deep, and they just want information to let them know so that they can go and say, I was right, there are aliens, which is a very different kind of a thing. I mean, with some exceptions. There were really incredibly edgy UFO researchers, say in the early 2000s. You had people like John Mack and, Edgar Mitchell, former astronaut. They were talking about how consciousness played a role in all this. And by the way, there's like a phony TTSA thing now where they had Lou Elizondo come out in white and be like, what if we are not and not is us? So it's like St. Lou. That was an interesting one. They stopped that pretty fast.
I don't think they got the reactions they wanted.
I don't think Enlightened Lou is or Enlightened Tom. But this is interesting to me because if the deep state researchers really got sharp on the UFO thing, we'd get to the bottom of the government side of it a lot quicker. Instead, I think you have a lot of gadflies around it, and I don't think that helps so much. So the clones part is very important because it's pretty well known that for the majority of his public life, Howard Hughes used doubles a lot to show up in different places and all the rest, as he wanted to retract and be in the background a lot more. But that process started to get used against him when he was being drugged up against his will. And there was a columnist who became an editor and ran his own paper called the Las Vegas Sun, and his name was Hank Greenspan. And he's very important in this story, although oft overlooked. But one of the things that he said was that Hughes was kidnapped and taken to the Bahamas. This is a very important piece of the story because the Hughes from the Bahamas story also comes up in the Clifford Irving tale. And we did a whole episode called Who is Tom Garden because of this very unusual story in what they say was the hoaxed Howard Hughes autobiography by Clifford Irving. But he had access to so many details. So the question was, how did he do it? A lot of weird things came out around that, including the fact that they eventually, after, if you really look at it, Tom Garden was used in that original book as the pseudonym that Howard Hughes was using when he was talking to Ernest Hemingway and flying into the hot zone with him. When they re-released the book inside of Clifford Irving writing from prison saying this is how I did the hoax book, he changed the name from Tom Garden to George Garden, which is very important because one of the things that Tom Garden had within it was this anagram. And so this is a very interesting process that was taking place in the early 70s. So what happened was Robert Mayhew, who was the CIA assassination guy who was there deep in the Hughes organization, finally came to a power struggle with the other forces inside the Hughes organization, and they kicked him out. And so what happened was, in the middle of all that, this autobiography comes out, and it's the autobiography of Howard Hughes. So they can't produce him if he's either drugged up and kidnapped on this place or already dead. So what they do is they stage a press conference, and it's only audio. So Hughes calls in, and this voice goes on. And if you listen to that, it seems like the most staged thing in history. But this is very important because there was awareness around this, let's call out the fake thing that Hughes is still alive, because Hughes was basically the richest man in the world. And with all those assets and all that money, and still no taxing of Hughes Aerospace, it's quite fascinating. Noah Dietrich, at the end of his life, who was a major Hughes aide for many years, said that in all of its existence, Hughes Aerospace only paid $20,000 in taxes, which is pretty remarkable. I mean, you'd expect like a bakery to pay $20,000 maybe in a year. So that kind of protection was very, very crucial. But what I want to get our heads wrapped around when we're thinking about this is we have to think of Hughes as himself and also this character. Now, this was supposed to be a picture of Hughes taken in 1972. This one, of course. And then this is Hughes more in his prime around 1952. In looking at those, the person that they were using who had checked into the hotel with Hughes' name and who's basically using Hughes credit cards and all that stuff is this guy over here. I would venture to guess that that's not Howard Hughes. And I think that what was happening, and there were a lot of releases of secret documents in that period, like the Gemstone file that alluded to this, that there was someone playing the role of Hughes so they could keep up the whole thing about, here's $1 million check for this and $1 million check for that. It's easy money. And why end a good game after all and find relatives looking for that empire? What happens then? So that process was very messy and played out over a series of years there, about 5 years in the early 70s, before they finally gave up and said, you know what, Hughes died and we're going to divvy out the money. So this is something that I think we need to keep in mind when we're looking at this period with Hughes, is that there's a dupe in the middle of things, right at the heart of it. So in dealing with the CIA clowns, we're dealing with the Howard Hughes clone. And this has to be kind of kept in mind as we get into this section. Okay. I want to say this about the Spruce Goose. It's very unusual even now. And the way that it's kept is just pristine. It is in actually McMinnville in Oregon. And McMinnville is very interesting because we've just mentioned there about Hughes' deep interest in UFOs. And whenever I look around that Spruce Goose and its development early on, it's an innovation in design. There's no question about it, that just being the nose of it. At the time, we just didn't have things along that line. They had the V-2 rockets and they had jets and things, but this was really a sort of a hybrid. One of the things that they did in the UFO story in McMinnville goes something like this. In 1950, two of the key photos that were ever taken in the UFO realm were taken by a farmer and his wife. And the farmer, he was quite interesting because they were the Trents and they were well known. So it wasn't something where like somebody took a picture trying to create a sensation or whatever. They were well known in the community. So when we look at that whole picture and everything else, it ended up on Time magazine. That's how much of a phenomenon this thing was. And those are some of the best pictures that we have that are available from that period. Now, when we find the Spruce Goose being moved to McMinnville, then we're looking at a very unusual circumstance, because how did it end up there? And it's in this evergreen aircraft museum. And it's quite remarkable because inside of there is also the SR-71, which was also a remarkable example of this X technology. Those two are there. Now, it took something like 5 years to move that thing after it had been gifted by the Summa Corporation of Hughes to the Aero Club in California. Then Disney had it, and then they move it up, voila.
Wait, don't skip over that. Disney had it.
Well, I mean, that is interesting if you think about it. You know, what exactly, it's kind of an interesting exhibit for Disney, but they had their hands on it. I think when we get our hands on the idea that this is an early version of the X technology, and so it's a symbol, which is why Google now has their headquarters inside the wing, which is why YouTube is beaming signals out directly from that wing. This is Hughes' innovation. And remember that the innovation of the hangar is also an innovation in terms of development. There may be, as we know, a kind of sacred geometry involved in this, which is why these things are so useful. Now, when we look at something like the hangar that the Spruce Goose was in, we can start to imagine, you know, our ability to really bore deeply underground started in this period. And where would you get you know, the facilities to be able to do that? The idea that these hangars were the first kind of experimental versions of these large underground tunnels and underground buildings really helped us get there, I think. This is one from Moffett Field. This is the original picture of that. That one in Moffett Field has also been acquired by Google. And the theme on that is Google takes over operations of Moffett Airfield from NASA. Will invest $200 million in the site. After years of using Moffett Field as the home and launch pad of the private jets of Google's founders, the company has agreed to a deal which will lease the airfield from NASA for the next 60 years. That's a long time. NASA announced that Planetary Ventures LLC, a shell organization operated by Google, how many do they have? How much are they taking over? But they have this great attraction, again, for these airfields. And in the case of the Spruce Goose and Moffett, I think that they're giving a nod to that technology. And I think that now having the Hughes Corporation embrace the underground activities of Elon Musk and doing these tunnels in Las Vegas and all the rest, and they're saying, you know what, bring SpaceX, bring Tesla here, because California is giving you a problem. Again, we have the Hughes wave reaching back in. The Hughes story is unfinished business from that period. It really is. It was never well figured out. How did somebody have that much influence? How did they, you know, develop so much innovation in medicine, in aerospace, you know, in gambling and casinos and all the rest of it? We're looking at a real innovation, and what you've got instead are these stories from people who are various insiders, you know, like I was behind Hughes or whatever it happened to be. You're not getting the real thrust of, well, what is the nature of this thing that was basically had such control over the political process in the country on one hand, but also was a major innovator on the aerospace side. Then how does the UFO file fit into that when we think of all the activities that are related to the UFO file that come directly out of Nevada, where what was housed there? The Hughes company. I mean, he was right there most of the time. Of course, he was in Texas. Of course, he was in the Bahamas. Of course, he was in Boston. But Las Vegas was really known as that center place. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist X Series 94 Clowns and Clones, Space Vegas, SpaceX Hughes UFO Mystery. We're going to take your questions here in a couple minutes and ask them in caps. Miss Olivia is ready for you. How are you doing out there?
Good. I love this question. Breach was saying, maybe the Spruce Goose is similar to the wooden Integratron. Very interesting, like sacred geometry,
yes.
Wood.
Yeah, it's an excellent point, actually. I thought it was interesting that they used wood, and the explanations that they gave for not using steel in the more traditional plane products didn't really fly for me. I mentioned Hank Greenspun back there, and I just want to do a couple of things that relate to this. Hank Greenspun, who was the editor for the Las Vegas Sun, he was known as a very, very connected guy, and he plays a part in the Hughes story, in the Nixon story, in the KLAS TV story, Lazar, and all the rest. But very early on, he played a role in sending arms to the group that would become the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, that would take over that part of Palestine and create the State of Israel. He actually got arrested for shipping armaments from Mexico to this group, the IDF, and they would eventually take over. And he was going to go to prison for it, but somehow they said, no, we're not going to put you in prison, but it's a $10,000 fine. And it was on his record. Now, what's quite fascinating to me is, and what people may not know a whole lot about, is that Kennedy has a very, very deep, John F. Kennedy, and the Kennedys in general, have a deep connection with that Las Vegas and Nevada crowd. There were a lot of projects going on around there, but of course there's the whole like Frank Sinatra mafia side and all the rest of it. But Greenspun went to Kennedy and he said, you know, I'm going to run for governor of Nevada. And even though I'm a Republican, I'm going to be your man on the inside. But because of my activities with trying to ship guns out to found the state of Israel, I violated the Neutrality Act. Is there a way you can pardon me? And John F. Kennedy did. He pardoned him so that he could run for governor in 1962. That's pretty interesting to me because JFK was a Democrat, of course, and to pardon a Republican editor who had helped found the State of Israel is quite interesting. But Greenspun didn't win the governorship. And here's also some oddness about Greenspun. Greenspun was very anti Joseph McCarthy. And he tried to get all of these charges against McCarthy and Roy Cohn for different things. He tried to basically turn it on them. And some of those attacks got pretty furious. They did things in that period, like they tried to call Cohn and McCarthy gay, which in the early 50s could be the death knell for your political life. So he was really, it's hard to figure out his loyalties and where they lie. Now, if you fast forward over a little bit of time, an interesting thing happens to Greenspun. First of all, he's running the Las Vegas Sun, and he's very unpopular with the FBI. But like I said, he had this kind of relationship with the Kennedys. I'm trying to figure out what was the nature of this. The day before the Kennedy assassination, something very interesting happens. An early morning blaze destroyed the Sun newspaper. And it burnt it to a crisp, and it stopped and it halted all of their news organization for quite a while. And flames got headquarters of newspaper. That took place the day before the Kennedy assassination. You have to wonder if they were worried about this guy and being in Las Vegas, right in the heart of that aerospace wing, that connection of the whole thing, and surrounded there by the mafia, surrounded there by the CIA and Hughes and all these different things. Was that going to be too much for this guy who was aware? Was he going to be kind of a weak link in their chain? Did they have to kind of put him back during this assassination? It's very important to consider. And when I look at Greenspun and I think of the things that he could accomplish, this is somebody who did take over, and he became the major face of Las Vegas news. And then in the early 70s, what we have is something very bizarre, which is before Watergate, we have our friends E. Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy. Before they set up that whole break-in and all the rest, in February of 1972, There's a whole setup around breaking into Hank Greenspun's safe to get information regarding Howard Hughes. Now, he was very close to Hughes, and interestingly enough, Hughes had helped him dramatically. And what I feel is that maybe we're looking at a situation of, eventually they came to say, well, they were trying to break in there because there was political information that would have been helpful, or there was some political information against Edward Muskie or people that were running for president. None of that stuff adds up at all. What does add up, what some researchers have pointed out, is that when you look at the break-ins around the safes, they're looking for something. And if we just look at the Watergate safe as one of the places where they were looking for this information, then it starts to make more sense. Hughes' activities and Hughes being so tight in developing this aerospace and the secret aerospace, the information that Greenspun had in his safe may have pertained to those types of contacts. Therefore, this group wanted it and wanted it badly. I don't think they wanted it because, there was some low-level Democrat who was running for president. Nixon had, that's why the Watergate story doesn't make any sense either. Nixon he won with 60% majority of the vote, 72. He'd gone to Russia, he'd gone to China. He was somebody who was on the move. For him to send these people in to get to these safes couldn't be just for political information that could hurt a Democrat like George McGovern, who had no prayers anyway. You're not going to risk your whole presidency for that. So what were they looking for? This is the question that was non-answered. And the question really around Watergate and what was in the safe of Larry O'Brien, who was the head of the DNC, well, there's an interesting history there too, because Larry O'Brien worked for Howard Hughes, and he was on a $15,000 a month retainer. Let's do some math. That's $180,000 a year back then. But here's what's odd about that. And again, Larry O'Brien was a major Democratic figure. And we know that Hughes was big on promoting Republican Nixon, and that, Mayhew, who worked for Hughes, had set up the RFK assassination. Larry O'Brien, whose safe was the safe that got broken into at Watergate, or that they were going in there to do that. He ran both Kennedy's presidential campaign in 1960. He was in the back car when Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. And then he was present as the campaign manager for Bobby Kennedy in 1968. O'Brien has an interesting history and trail, and you find it goes right through Las Vegas, but he becomes the NBA commissioner. And he'll hold that job from 1974 to 1985. And it's very interesting to me the way that these people intersect and operate. But really, if we look at things happening in 1972 as people are hopping through these safes looking for information regarding Howard Hughes, then let's just strip away the political side of it and say, what is the information that they're looking for regarding Hughes? And it puts us, I think, in the right frame of mind. And now I have more I'm actually going to present, but we're up to the questions point. So what I'm going to do is turn it over to you, and I'm going to keep the questions rolling. What you want to do is ask the questions all in caps and make sure that you keep them going. And what I'm going to try to do is just cover a few more things before we jump in on the questions, if that's okay. Now, I have something, I just wanted to round out something that I mentioned in relation to Musk back here, which is when he was talking about those Legos. I hope I was clear about that. They were making these little ancient Egyptian kits. And the kits had the Sphinx and all the rest of it. And here he is tweeting about it, saying the first kit set will be ancient Egypt, pyramids, Sphinx, Temple of Horus. And those are his tweets. And then further down, he said, and they said I'd never be a rock star, alluding to this fact that he's now drilling rocks. So the SpaceX manager is so obsessed with space. I'm Mr. Space. Space is my thing. Let's nuke Mars, as he said before, which is a weird thing to say. Suddenly, he's in charge of the Boring Company. What do? They bore underground in Las Vegas to set up what? A gigantic, we're going to set up these whole metropolises. People will be more comfortable underground. You'll be amazed at the things we can do. We built one for the convention center in Las Vegas, which is true. They have done it. And it says the boring company is out to disrupt the tunnel boring business. So his idea of building these massive tunnels, I believe, as I started the program with, there's a massive underground infrastructure, and that people like Musk, they need a program to come forward where they can connect all that stuff that they've already built and pretend that it's new. Like, look at this amazing thing this guy did. And he pulled it off only in a couple of months. Now, what they need that for, and how to make that go online and all the rest, there's a lot of things that happen underground. People like Catherine Austin Fitts or Joseph Farrell and the researchers that I follow, Professor Peter Dale Scott with the continuity of government COG work, they understand that there's a massive underground infrastructure. For most of us, we just don't have any clue about it. It's not part of what we do. It's not part of our, everyday existence, thinking about what happens underground. Occasionally, when there are weird things, like when people say, well, you keep hearing these things about these trumpets going off or weird sounds of, it sounds like construction, but I can't tell where it's coming from. There is a massive infrastructure underground. Things that have come above board to the public, things like the Denver airport, for example. People have become aware because of that there are these extensive programs that relate to this. Yeah, you have one.
Susan Herbstreit wants to know, child trafficking underground?
No question. Well, when you get into places like Las Vegas, that type of activity, I'm sure, is very prevalent. I think underground is used for all kinds of things. When we look at the massive amount of people who pour over these borders and then are never heard from again, that's pretty interesting too, because the idea that where do they go? And the way that I look at it is, we have to think about what kind of an infrastructure could be protected in that way. And, what would you do with anything like that? How would you maintain it? How could it be a government? You'd have to have tons of people who worked for it. And then you'd have, elevators and vehicles and all the rest. How would you hide that economy? This is the thing.
Reason 8432 wanted to know about your opinion on Phil Schneider.
It's so interesting. Schneider is somebody who comes up in a very important role as a whistleblower. And he only starts whistleblowing the summer before his death. And you might read Alexandra Bruce's book called The Philadelphia Experiment Murder. Alexandra's our friend. She runs the Forbidden Knowledge.
Alexandra's great.
And
very passionate.
Yeah, she's fantastic. All the work that she's doing with Forbidden Knowledge TV is remarkable right now, especially. But one of the things that I think in relation to this is it seemed like he knew things that came from experience. And then there were other areas where he just seemed to be, kind of disturbed in some way. So it was hard. It was always hard to figure out where it was coming from. But I think the possibility that he and special forces people were working on underground tunnels is very easy to verify. I think that part is real. And then he talked a lot about that there were aliens that, we were working with underground. It's hard stuff to verify, but then it makes you wonder, doesn't it? So I feel like there's definitely some truth to that. And it's very hard because when people come out as whistleblowers for that side of life, I think it's very rare because they have to get ridiculed or they have to get pushed off the stage. So this is a very kind of crucial thing. That whole underground experience, and we had the Richard Sauter interviews a couple of years ago, and he really is the expert on that. I don't know if he's done so much on it lately, but he showed that there was that massive infrastructure that existed. So the question is, what do you do with that? Really, ultimately, you keep building it up, and you get to a certain point where, it becomes an economy, a world of its own. And then if it builds up to a point where you've used all this stolen money from the government to do it, and you are hiding behind the continuity of government rules that say, oh, it's an emergency, so you can't question me on how I spend the money. You might need to integrate that into the regular economy. Some people said that they did 9/11 in order to get the black budget on budget through the Emergency Powers Act. So, it is interesting, I think, when we look at it from those different angles. Okay. Everyone, I'll remind you, it's the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 94. We're going deep now on Hughes and Aerospace, clowns and clones, and our friend Elon Musk. And I have to say about Musk, it's not a personal. When I'm presenting these things about Musk, I find that what he's doing, the way that he's being positioned, is very intriguing to me, because they're making him kind of almost like a caricature of Hughes in a way. They're giving him too many important roles. They're consolidating too much authority into one figure. And so when you have Jeff Bezos, he has a similar type of thing, where he's in charge of Amazon, now he's in charge of food. And then Gates, who's had a terrible rollout because he's, people seem to see through him better than anybody. But trying to make him a doctor, it's, ridiculous, right? He's not a doctor. And then putting him in charge of this whole Corona operation. But then one of the things that RFK Jr. told me in our interview, and we're going to have RFK Jr. back on the show to talk more about what's been going on, is he told me that Gates organized and runs and owns a lot of the satellite infrastructure that we're on. That's pretty interesting.
Just in case we weren't freaked out enough.
Lex Luthor has satellites. Think about that. I hate to call him Lex Luthor because, Lex Luthor's a lot cooler than Bill Gates.
Definitely. But, Lex Luthor in a lavender cashmere sweater.
Exactly. So I want to remind you to go to darkjournalists.com, sign up for the newsletter. That keeps us in touch with each other. And about once a week, you're going to get an email just letting you know what shows are coming up. We have some incredible shows and guests coming up for you. Of course, you got first access to the documentary when it came out through that newsletter. And, you basically get it directly in your inbox, all the important shows and things that we have coming up for you. And like I mentioned on the documentary, the X-Protect UFO file assassins, that's going to inform so much of the work that we have going forward that I highly recommend it. I've put it out there for free for people. We're going to do about 4 of these documentaries. Maybe we'll sell the set or something, but that one is out there. It's free, and it's about an hour long. It's a good intro in a sense, but it goes a lot deeper than an intro, but it does give you that overview of the Hughes situation relating to the aerospace takeover and what we're dealing with now. So I think going forward, I recommend, in terms of watching the X-Series show, to make sure that you watch the documentary to give you that kind of best focus on the whole thing. And while you're there, subscribe to the Dark Journalist website. We've made it really affordable and accessible, and we'll try to do that for as long as we can there on the site. But go and subscribe, get behind the program. I say this a lot, and I think Millennial Millie is another example of this. The people who go out and want to give you that information, get them that support so they have it. Don't let them be a lone outpost somewhere that just, is saturated by mainstream shadow banning. Make sure you get behind them, let them know that they're doing the right work, and use as much power as you can to help their organizations move forward. There's a lot of really great ones, and we've had great support here. We appreciate it. Make sure you spread the word, get people behind the show, and that we can do more with the help that we receive from you. It is crucial. So thank you very much. Okay, now what we need to do is put it all together. Why are they building this? So we've taken a look, just to summarize, and we've seen that Google has been taking over these hangars. In the case of the hangar and the lease that they have on the Spruce Goose hangar, like I said, the building was sold for $270 million. These are no small expenditures. So it is the identification that they're involved with that is crucial. So Google is doing it, SpaceX is doing it. They're all embedded inside the X technology. We showed you Moonshot, like from Google X, and Teller, who is Edward Teller's grandson, who are deeply involved in the idea of low Earth orbit satellites. And then we have Gates building satellites. And then we have Musk talking about going to Mars. What is that infrastructure in space that's been built over 50 years in the dark, except for we've had a few things like, Challenger and space shuttles. And a lot of those blew up too. Was that a warning to just quit the space program on the public side? We have to keep these things in mind and then realize that China and India are expanding in this way. So we've been in a blind alley on the UFO side. The UFO file has built from secrecy. X-Protect has been involved in secrecy from the beginning. But now they have to, with all of this stuff happening, we can't necessarily control what India or China is going to say if their people start seeing UFOs, if they're doing commercial tourism, space tourism, asteroid mining, and things of this nature. So we have to kind of open up to the idea that we're looking at a different world that needs to be presented. And they've known, and they've watched closely on the UFO file, and they realize that technology that they've been using and they've kept from the public, that they need to roll some of this out in order to display their advantage. And it's inevitable with the other countries coming on board. So how are they going to do this? The CIA and groups like this are trying to take over the megaphone on this. And they take it over in sloppy articles in the New York Times, which I tell you are very, very sloppy articles, considering what they're trying to do. And through narratives where, they're presenting these things like, oh, look, we just found what UFOs are, as if there hadn't been 75 years of people researching the subject and getting Air Force records and all the rest of it. It's just like, no, Lou Elizondo, he found it, and he found a Tic Tac UFO, and look at this grainy footage, and, pretend that we're presenting something to the public. This is a CIA. The CIA has been involved in the lethal guarding of the secrecy around the UFO file. This has to be considered whenever you deal with the Central Intelligence Agency. Yes, Ms. Olivia.
Jeff Johnson wanted to know about X-Protect being Majestic 12, their relationship.
Well, Majestic 12 was there to study the problem for the most part. X-Protect would be more like their dirty little secret. So, if Vannevar Bush and these other scientifically minded officials could interact with CIA heads and stuff, they would share information about a particular thing. But you can't picture, for example, MJ12 going after, like a Frank Edwards or one of these guys. So when we think about that, we have to think of X-Protect as a group that resides inside the aerospace wing of the intelligence outfits. And that their methods are very unusual. That's why the whole Men in Black thing is so unusual for us to understand just looking at it from the outside, because they seem to have abilities which go far further than just knocking people off or intimidating them or destroying their reputations. In some cases, they seem to have the ability to psychically harass them, for example. They seem to be able to display almost astral projection type tendencies. Disappearing, things like that, invisibility, which you could ascribe to technology for sure, but there's something extra going on in the realm of X-Protect. But I think that we've looked at X-Protect, for example, in the documentary, we've seen them as that group that guards the secrecy. And they've been behind major, major political things like assassinations and deep events in the Professor Scott sense. So when we look at that, we can see that they have an overwhelming influence on our culture, and that we've been completely, except for a little bit, we've been completely blind to their influence. And I think about, they've made these kind of almost comedy movies about the Men in Black. But when I was reading about the Spruce Goose connection with Google and how Google had taken this over for YouTube, one of the movies that they shot in there was Independence Day, right? So I
Wow.
never saw Independence Day, but I know at the end they blow up the White House, right? But if you think of the messaging around that, who are they renting that out for? It's pretty good. All right, what else you got?
Okay, so Kathleen Tootle wants to know, what are they looking for underground? And Christine Taggart says, DJ, could Gates and Musk be using satellite network to find and operate the Two-Eye Stone? And how could the Black Knight fit into this?
Oh, wow, those are good questions.
Yeah.
Well, think about this with the Two-Eye Stone question. The CIA infiltrated, that is, sent people into the ARE, the Casey Foundation, between 1962 and 1964, because they wanted to know, and they had a program to find out about Casey's readings on the Hall of Records. And the Hall of Records, which is supposed to be under the Sphinx, according to Casey, it's under the right paw of the Sphinx. It's a chamber that contains the knowledge from Atlantis, including the knowledge about how to set up the Two-Eye Stone. It's a power station, by the way, which the Atlanteans used to blow themselves up. When we think about these leaders that we're looking at, Elon Musk, Bezos, and these big tech leaders, and we see the scientific community kind of running over a cliff and not using ethics, we're moving into cloning and all these different subjects, but we're not using that spiritual sensibility. We're just trying to outdo the other guy. We have to think about that because we've lost that grasp. And so these people have lived through in the cultural memory this incident that happened in Atlantis, where according to people like Rudolf Steiner and Edgar Casey, who really went deep on this, and really their theories keep getting proved right. I saw this huge thing that Graham Hancock put out 2 weeks ago saying that they had found these caves where they had been mining red ochre. And that was in 11,000 BC. Well, if you're doing mining operations, you're a pretty sophisticated culture. No one was supposed to be here doing any of that, So these things are getting unfolded. So the idea of looking at things from space, and I talked to Carmen Bolter about her work looking for pyramids in Egypt underground. She's using all of that. She'll hire out a space company. So people, what those companies predominantly get used for is finding oil, for example. But what's fascinating to me is they've had a crazy advantage all this time because they can see with that penetrating radar and everything from space where these things are. So certainly they look for them. And have they found the Two-Eye Stone, I think, is a very interesting question. I sure hope not.
Okay, David Tormina. DJ, are the tunnels and spaceports a luxury for a breakaway civilization like a safe haven?
It's a separate civilization. But I think the fact that they, this thing about Musk and his Boring Company, I think is very interesting. Because why should Musk have an underground drilling company? I think they're looking with Musk for a kind of a triumvirate of things that he can be useful for: space, underground operations, and electric vehicles, self-driving cars and things like that. And how they can wrap these all together, I think, is interesting. But it seems to me that they have an underground setup, an underground facility of massive proportions that they've been building since Hughes era, certainly post-war era. So that's a good 70, 75 years of development. So what can you build in 70, 75 years with a kind of unlimited budget? It must be quite fantastic, but the people on the surface are completely disconnected from it. Just like we're disconnected from the knowledge that's in, the X technology that is in the UFO file. We don't get access to it, but it controls all these things that we see, the pharmaceutical takeover that we're in the middle of right now. You can look at these eras of things. You look at 9/11, for example. It is a takeover of essential human rights. They're able to declare a state of emergency, which they've never relinquished. So that's the suspend the Constitution op. The next op is the 2008 crash. And then they get Obama in, and instead of being like a hero, he becomes the person who is the clerk for the bankers, and he initiates the financial coup. So you get a financial coup d'etat, and then a constitutional coup d'etat, and in 2020, the pharmaceutical coup d'etat. So they've timed these about 10 years apart. And so when you look at that, inevitably, the one that they're coming to is the space coup d'etat. And that is where something from space is unleashed, and they say, oh, it's enough of an emergency that we have to take away all your rights and your communications and everything else. So we have to kind of look at that and the risk of that. And we have to see that they're building another civilization so that they can survive that while we fight things out on the surface. I think that that's true.
Okay, this is really interesting. I'm going to connect these. So, Alan Carna says, John Brandenburg, The Death of Mars, speaks of nuclear weapons used on Mars. Solar system-wide war in space. Mars got nuked circa 250,000 years ago. Flying Memorial says, the Boring Company makes sense for the Mars colonization. I'm so curious if Musk has read Dr. Brandenburg's work. They're going to need to plant a lot of hemp to reclaim that radioactive soil. I wouldn't doubt it. It's a really interesting connection.
There's a lot of interesting stuff in that question. By the way, I think that people have read things for Musk for a long time. So certainly someone has read that for him and come back to him with notes. That's the way it
executive
works.
Summaries.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
That's your white paper, guys. See, it's interesting because Hughes really wanted nuclear testing stopped. And I think that that is interesting in terms of your question, in terms of what he wanted to do. It was a singular obsession for him to get them to stop doing this. So he understood something about it as well. But I think that Brandenburg and his theories, you know, I did a conference with Brandenburg, it's like 5 years ago now. But I got to talk to him, and he was a fascinating guy. And we've talked subsequently, and I plan to have him participate in the show or events that we're going to do, because his work is very interesting. But there's also the weird thing where he's a government scientist, and they allow him to talk about things like nuclear explosions on Mars. It's pretty strange. It's pretty strange. His presence and his work is very interesting. It's almost like a gift from somewhere, and you wonder who's giving you the gift. But I also thought that about the Ringmakers of Saturn guy as well. I'll think of his name in a minute. Yes.
Robert Ayala, where does Trump's Space Force fit in all this?
This is it. Trump's Space Force, this is so important. Trump's been in the heart of this question around space. This is the interesting thing to understand about him. His relationship with Nixon, Nixon's deep knowledge of the UFO file. And also remember, Nixon was president during the moonshot. So in terms of how that worked, he could easily inform him about that. Roy Cohn, being his political mentor, he is somebody who was identified as part of Defense Industrial Security Command, which is like NASA security. That's a very deep level of space information. And then John G. Trump, who, you know, it's inevitable, he researched for Vannevar Bush, who was in charge of the UFO file. He was sent out to research Tesla's papers upon his death. So those things we have all on the record. It gives us a thread that Trump knew a lot coming in on the UFO file. The Space Force is something that no other president had deemed. You know, they didn't do it. The sixth branch of the armed services. This is a very major move. The only problem is that somewhere along the line in there, some neocon whispered in his ear, say space is for war fighting. So he said, oh, space will be a war fighting domain, so we'll make it a measure of the armed services. There was another way to do that, to make space research science-based, and you'd have to do it that way. So it's very tricky the way that they've set up, because once you lose Trump, then you have a hostile thing in space. And certainly it could happen during Trump's tenure as well, but just going on the idea that he built the Space Force in order for it to be defense oriented, that's different. But I believe that from watching Trump in relation to this subject on UFOs, I think he knows a great deal about it. And I think the Space Force is, again, like Reagan, like JFK, and like Nixon, that attempt to pull the UFO file back under the presidential umbrella. I think people like Bush didn't feel the need to do that because he was so plugged into the corrupt corporate deep state machine. And I think people like Obama were just propped in. They didn't care about what the job should entitle them to. They just had a script that they needed to run. So Clinton, I don't know. It's a good question. Yes.
You've addressed this in many other episodes, but Ray Story wants to know, do you think John Trump's connection with Vannevar Bush put him in the know on UFOs?
Yeah.
But of course.
Interesting. I just mentioned him. It's a good follow-up question. Look, here's what we found, what we presented on this program in Tesla, Trump, and the Time Capsule in March 2018? I think it was somewhere in there. And it was very simple. On the record, we have physicist Robert Sarbarker, who gets called out of retirement in the 80s by a couple of UFO researchers where his name has turned up in a few documents, and they want to know. And he spills his guts. He says, we had a UFO redevelopment program, yes. The person in charge of the program was Vannevar Bush. The person who took it over from Vannevar Bush was John von Neumann. Those people are on the record based on what Sarbarker said, and Sarbarker was there. I've pointed out before that they've tried to make Sarbarker a non-citizen. He doesn't even have a Wikipedia page, so he's a non-person in 1984 terms. And he died under mysterious circumstances after talking about these things. Big surprise, but that's an ex-protect kind of thing, which is you don't talk out of school once you retire. But it's interesting. I mean, it's bizarre in any case. And what happened was, once he pointed out that structure, people started to dig a little bit. But the digging that I did was, I said, well, Vannevar Bush, if he was in charge of this, and he showed up in MJ12 documents, but people didn't trust the documents, okay. But Sarbarker was on the record. So we didn't have to trust phantom documents. He already had said it. And he reiterated it. So if Vannevar Bush was in charge of the UFO file, his protege at MIT was John G. Trump, who was a professor. But Vannevar Bush was the dean, and this was his guy. And the reason that the FBI called in John G. Trump was because Vannevar Bush had said, when Tesla died, they went to Vannevar Bush and they said, who should we get to sift through this vast resources of Tesla's papers? And he said, get my man Trump. And then when you consider that relationship, which Trump reiterates was a close relationship over and over again, you have to say that he's signaling to those people, I know about the UFO file. That I don't think is by accident, and it could account, aside from, I think that people get the wrong idea sometimes, that they say, I don't like Trump, therefore he can't know about UFOs. That's not the way it works. You can like or hate somebody in the political spectrum. Think about the difference between people on Nixon or Obama or somebody. It doesn't matter what we think of them. Their level of knowledge is their level of knowledge. And it doesn't even make them extra smart or anything. It just means they were plugged into this information. So therefore, when we look at John Trump sitting at the door of the person who, who was made him a protege, and that person controls the UFO file, I mean, anything around that rad lab, I get the UFO impression from. So certainly John G. Trump and Vannevar Bush, that's a very tight lock, I think. think about this too. John G. Trump, when he went further in his scientific activities, he didn't go off just into radiation. He went off into shortwave microwaves to space. So the guys that he studied with were all X-rays, but he went into space. That's very interesting to me. And they did it for communication and other things. But for him to have that space interest, to be sponsored by Vannevar Bush, I would think that Trump would get that information from John G. Trump, and I don't think that there's any doubt that he possessed it. So the only question would be, would he share it with his nephew? And they seem to be pretty close. Yes.
David Termina, DJ, it appears to me that the Martian Hungarians were at war with the paperclip Nazis, all the while being controlled by secret societies. What say you?
Something was driving. It's very interesting. I was trying to sort some of this out because when you get into Nixon, you've got the paperclip Nazi Operation Paperclip program locked in with Nixon's rise. So, and he has access to those people. Those people, the paperclip operation, don't seem to like Kennedy. He seems to be a real thorn in their side. So the Hungarian thing, Teller represents part of that. Von Neumann, they're in there. That scientific flexing is very interesting. The person who kind of is outside of that is Oppenheimer. And one thing that people overlook, because of so many other things going on in the statements of Sarbarker, is he points to Oppenheimer as somebody that they called in often to look over the UFO aspect. So later, they try to do all these things to intimidate Oppenheimer, say he was a communist and all the rest of it. And you wonder again, just like he didn't want to use nuclear weapons for an immoral purpose, if he wasn't caught up in a moral dispute with these people. Like Teller wanted to use any advantage. His suggestion was to use the hydrogen bomb on the Soviet Union.
He's a maniac.
He's vicious. And think about it, it's his grandson, Astro Teller, who runs Google X. So, has he disavowed his father's Marshall philosophy? It's a question. But there they are, flexing the X technology and the X steganography. They're all there now, and they're there at the corridors of power, standing there with the X steganography in the 21st century. They've got it. They definitely have the ability.
So are these Martians, right?
That's what they called them, yeah.
What are we dealing with? Are we dealing with Atlanteans who have reincarnated into this time?
Yeah, well, see, this is very cosmological when you get to that level. Of course, they call them Martians as a joke.
Sort of.
Originally.
Maybe.
But then again, when you think about this, it gets very odd, including von Braun's story about Mars. Mars, when you look at the Steiner material and you look at Edgar Cayce's material, has a certain function, just like Saturn has a certain function. And one of the things that I'm going to open up here, which you probably haven't heard, is that Tesla and Musk, with his Boring Company, are building the tunnels for the next CERN. So that brings us...
Can you repeat that, please?
Musk and Tesla with Boring,
yes.
They are digging the tunnels for the next CERN. So CERN has taken them on.
So he already has the contract.
He's taken them on, and they're already advising, and they're already being a part of that, digging out the trenches for that. So they are...
And where is it?
Well, it's close by to where the other one.
Okay, so they're just expanding their territory.
Yeah, well, this is the Large Hadron Collider 2. Okay, so CERN is always going to be there in Geneva, right? But the CERN Large Hadron Collider, they had the first one, and that was a $6 billion project. This one's 5 times bigger, and it is Tesla. He's the one who's digging it out. Now, this is remarkable. That's what this question made me think of, because when you think of that cosmological part, or I don't even know if this is cosmology, but Cayce, in going into his readings now and looking at the things, because he had such a a great snapshot on the 21st century. But when he would do retro cognitive and looked back at the Atlantean times, he said that those people were reincarnating now. And the now was in the early 40s. So we've seen so much of their world and then their next generation, right? So right in the heart of all this Atlantean technology, again, somehow the circumstances and the situation got set up to where this Atlantis thing would happen again. Now we're playing it out. And you might have seen, and we've had shows where we talked about this with Gigi Young. Gigi's doing a thread on that, actually. She's Mystic in the Moon on Twitter. She did something about this relating to Mars and Atlantis. That was right. It's right to the core of this question. But what it comes down to is this. They come in with a predisposition. They've caused destruction before using advanced technology. It doesn't mean the technology is bad. Look at me. I used to edit a technology magazine for a decade, right? Do I think technology is bad? No. The reason I know Las Vegas is because I used to go to the CES technology shows. So that whole end of things, we want to be able to embrace the technology without losing our humanity. That's where the Gurdjieff work came from. Use the machines without becoming a machine, and certainly don't become subservient to the machines. This is what it comes down to. If the machines are used properly, you can become more spiritual by using them. Okay.
Okay, David Tormina again. DJ, I would rather stay on the surface of the Earth no matter what. I suspect Armon would seek to draw us underground.
Yes. Well, what Steiner said in relation to Ahriman was that he wanted to make the Earth a gigantic deep freeze. That's an interesting statement. When he Steiner tuned into Ahriman and predicted so much of the 21st century technology. And he said that spirit would come through the technology and that eventually Ahriman would have an incarnation. And it sounded to me like he was going to have an incarnation as a cyborg, essentially. And then you hear these signs, you think that's incredible, But then later, after reading Steiner, I would hear these scientists like Kurzweil saying, talking about the singularity. I am going to merge into that machine. Nothing will stop me from doing it, and I'll become more powerful than God. There's nothing that you can do to stop it. That's the way that they think. So it's a spiritual and a cultural challenge, I would say, dealing with them. But certainly the question about Ahriman is this. When Steiner tuned into him, he felt himself heavy, right? He felt like he was in concrete. So that wave of Ahriman, who's tied up in some way with the evolution of the Earth, it is this incredible challenge. Of course, Ahriman is the name that Steiner used for this force, but it is a Persian devil. It was the devil in that, and the counterpoint to Hermozda.
I love this question.
Yeah.
Danielle Jorgensen. DJ, did H.G. Wells tell us all with the Morlocks and the Eloi in the time machine, given his connections?
Yes.
I love that movie.
And it's very interesting, isn't it? It's a fantastic movie. What happens is the Eloi are on the surface of the planet, and they're like blonde, airy-fairy people, but they don't know how to do anything. And the Morlocks create everything from underground. And once in a while, the Morlocks are like, hey, come downstairs into underground and hang out with us. And then half of them don't come back because the Morlocks are cannibals. So they degenerated to that level. And on the surface, they had this kind of airy thing. So there's a little bit of Brave New World in it as well. But it is very important, and this is so important when we talk about millennials and this whole thing. We see people identifying as being a millennial. They have to be careful not to surrender too much over to the technology. Like, oh, I have the watch. It tells me what to do and this kind of thing. I think that's kind of a crucial thing. You always want to be your own person and then using the technology as an adjunct, making you better. This idea that you can become a slave to a thing so that you don't develop any skills, you still want to be able, and I've been hearing that they've been taking cursive writing out of curriculum in schools. See, that's ridiculous because that is a core aspect of developing your brain's function and your ability to express. Those forces that want to do that are part of the force that wants to create a huge slave race, and they think themselves superior by doing that. And really all it takes is you going along with it, right? I mean, if somebody ordered you around and you said, okay, I'll do it, then you become their slave. That's just how it goes. The only reason that they don't do that is because they know you'll tell them to go to hell, So that's what you have to do when you run into things like the technology takeover or the pharmaceutical takeover, and Gates and people trying to control your life and say, like, don't worry, I'm only going to give you 10 vaccines every time you have a problem, because it keeps their programs going. And they're like, we can use the whole of the globe as an experiment, we'll get them all in our algorithm and we'll have life as we see it. You just don't allow people to go there. And this is the thing that we have to learn. So there's a lot of that story of the time machine, which H.G. Wells is deep, deep, deep in that kind of Orphic circle group of literary people. Remember, Dickens was in the Orphic circle. They understand. And the Orphic circle were very advanced in terms of understanding psychic expression and where the future was headed. And they were giving us these things and these stories, I think, for a reason. But yeah, that's a really good one.
Bo Krause has an interesting question. He says, he wants to know what you think about the picture with all the electronic equipment inside the Spruce Goose. He says, as a USAF vet, I have to say that station looks just like a modern USAF electronic warfare station. I mean, why the hell would you need all of that inside a wooden, privately owned boat plane?
I like that question, and that is a very informed question. Look, there's something very strange about the Spruce Goose story. Right down to the fact that when they brought it into McMinnville, they used a dummy of Hughes. It's Hughes' final clone, right? It's his final double. It's not very easily explainable. There's another odd thing that happened in relation to this, which is when the Spruce Goose got to the Evergreen Museum, there were some people who wanted to take the owner of the Spruce Goose Museum, and they wanted to take him out, and he seemed to be getting into trouble. He was the head of Evergreen Aviation. He's no longer alive. He's a very interesting guy, actually. His name was Delford Smith. This might give us a clue, actually. I have a little bit of his bio here that I'm going to read. And Delford Smith was an American aviator and businessman. He was from Oregon, and he graduated the University of Washington. He'd been in the Air Force. He founded Evergreen Helicopters. Whenever you get around this helicopter military use and stuff, you start to get those connections. Eventually, he's identified with deep connections with the CIA and even around Iran-Contra and all these other things. But he headquartered his stuff in McMinnville, which, as we know, had the huge UFO sighting, which we started off with. And then he started the Evergreen Aviation and Space Museum. And then they brought the Spruce Goose there. Now, so we get just a snapshot of him, and then we start to think that there were these stories coming out where it was ruffled feathers over future of Howard Hughes' Spruce Goose. There were these things coming out where it was almost like there were groups who were trying to get their hands on the Spruce Goose or wanted to destabilize the symbolism or something that was going on with it. But what ended up happening was that he triumphed, and they were able to keep it there at the Evergreen Aviation Museum. And the museum was bailed out by a group that dealt with all these incredible wines. And it's quite fascinating, actually, because that group would wind up doing the McMinnville UFO festivals. They're the ones who put on the McMinnville UFO festivals. So you've got the UFO festival now tied in with the people who control the Spruce Goose, which is sitting right where the sighting happened that put McMinnville on the UFO map years and years previously. So, there's a lot of weird questions to that. And when you think about what Bruce Morgan told us in relation to Yvonne DiCarlo, her close relationship with Hughes, and him saying, to her cousin and flying with her cousin that he was fascinated by UFOs and he wanted to know where the design, came from, basically. So the question is, maybe he got to the end of that question and he figured out how to redevelop them. And so there's some exercise of the X technology in the Spruce Goose. But I agree with you, and I'm not a pilot or anything like that, but just your observation there, when you look at that picture, it is remarkable because we have to understand Hughes, I think, in a very different fashion. He's very advanced in that period. And I think that people like to really think of his Hollywood period or his neurotic period, but he's somebody who, I think that they are sculpting Musk in his likeness. Yes.
Two things. One, someone pointed out that Spruce is an evergreen, right?
Oh, yes.
On the street, which is interesting. And Saturnian Lotus said the Aero Goosey, Goose for short, was the original flying machine of Peter Menace at the Sonora Aero Club.
Oh, that's really interesting.
It is.
Walter Bosley did a really good book on the Sonora Aero Club. And it's pretty interesting because when you get into the things around Delschow and his paintings of flying machines, the stuff is pretty advanced for the 19th century. And one of the paintings looks exactly like a nuclear reactor or uranium development center. When you think about that, like, who had access to that in that period? Not to mention that Delschow, I should have it here, but since you brought it up, Delschow has a painting of one of these airships, and it says in there, Trump, and then it is the 45th in the collection. Now, I don't like to be super over-the-top superstitious about everything, but that's pretty unusual considering Trump's the 45th president. Just the fact that his name is there in the middle of the Sonora Aero Club paintings and that it's 45 might give you some indication, at least, that Trump lineage had an airship. They were connected with the whole Aero Club stuff. But yeah, that's very interesting. The other thing about Evergreen is something that you pointed out, which is it was the Secret Service name for
Hillary Clinton.
Yeah. Put that one together. Now we're talking. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 94. And we've gone deep into Space Vegas, Clowns and Clones, SpaceX, Hughes, and the UFO mystery. A couple of things I didn't mention around Hank Greenspun. Actually, I'm going to indulge you to let me read these real briefly, and then we're going to get back to your questions. I wanted to mention this about Hank Greenspun, who was the editor of the Las Vegas Sun, whose offices were firebombed before the Kennedy assassination, and who Kennedy pardoned so he could run for governor. He's an unusual character in that he gets mixed up with this Hughes stuff, and then the Watergate burglars before Watergate try to break into his safe, and that he thinks it's Hughes related. That's what he told his aides. So what was it that people were jumping through hoops for on Hughes and these safes to do all these high-profile things that eventually get Nixon taken down? December 11th, 1970, Greenspun contacts the FBI and corroborates a story of Howard Hughes being forcibly transported from a Las Vegas hotel during an internal battle for corporate control. This, I think, could be it. If he had, this is an FBI file that came out later, if by December 11th, 1970, he had proof, being the newspaper guy, the kind of king of Las Vegas news, if he had proof and contacted the FBI to say that Hughes was being forcibly transported from a Las Vegas hotel, you know where they sent him? They sent him to the Bahamas, where, but strangely enough, John Meyer, who was a top aide to Hughes and who we featured in the documentary, and we brought him up here before, he's brought forward so many important things. And he's in Canada now and retired, but he, they had run all these ops on him and chased him pretty much all over the globe. But he had said that he had seen Hughes cryogenically frozen. So this gets us into very interesting territory because, we have to think about it like this. Whatever they were doing with Hughes, they wanted to continue to do it without his mood swings or him finding out or whatever. And so at a certain point, they were just like, let's grab him and take him out. So if Greenspun had found a witness for this and had contacted the FBI about it, I think it's pretty likely that that's a good reason, because for whoever had abducted him, for those people to get that information. And I think that's where the whole hoax Clifford Irving biography came from. And I think it's where these very high-profile break-ins into these safes happen. Now, they couldn't break into Greenspun's safe. They broke open the front part and they couldn't get in further, so they took off. But if people had found those guys, if they had found E. Howard Hunt and McCord and all those guys, then Watergate would have never happened because they would have never been around to do it. But they were looking apparently for the same thing, because when they break into O'Brien's safe, remember, O'Brien's getting paid almost $200,000 a year from Hughes. So there's something going on there that got missed, basically, and I think that's what it is. Okay, yes.
Okay, so recent 8432, did Hughes ever go to Antarctica?
Well, it's very interesting. He flew around the world.
We may not have any proof of it. What's your gut feeling?
No, I don't have any real, we'd have to really look at that because he did incredible aviation work, but I don't seem to recall in everything I've read about Hughes that he went to Antarctica. I mean, the Admiral Byrd stuff, that would have been a big inspiration for him. But I don't know. I don't know if that had been organized or if he had a great desire for it. So I would say, off the top of my head, I don't think he went there, but we certainly can track it down. What's interesting is on the sundial I showed from Google on that floor plan, they have Antarctica as the first spoke of the zodiac, as it were, and right after that's Easter Island. I think a little bit of a study of how that came about. There's no background on it. I've looked very hard for why they chose those things. There isn't any good background on it. So there's a reason in my mind that they chose those locations.
Yeah, a cult fan really was suggesting that those are specific stargates. And I think that's an intriguing idea.
That's a good, yeah. I would go with you on that. All right, everyone, we're going to take a couple more questions. I want to invite you to go to the Dark Journalist website, sign up there at darkjournalist.com for our newsletter. The newsletter contains all the important things that we have coming up for you. And there's so much interesting things coming up in relation to these interviews that are happening, these shows that we're doing, and events and everything that's heading into this fall. And we have a very sharp focus in the fall for things that are going on while the mayhem of the election is going to be over that. And they're going to be, screaming for your attention. Or, oh, this protest or that protest, or, with the Fauci goggles. And they're going to try to make that mandate. All this nonsense is going to be, and then they're going to look for that boomerang point where the elastic snaps and people push back. They've been weighing out for that one. So while all that craziness is going on, we're still going to try to bring you these important developments that we have. I think if we can really tie down the Musk-Hughes part and connect what happens in between, if Musk shows up in the 90s and Hughes ticketed out in the 70s, if we can put together that 20 years of development, we could pretty much find out who's in charge on the aerospace side, which I think is a worthy goal. The other thing I want to remind you to do is to sign up for the newsletter, but also go there and subscribe to the site, get behind the program, get behind the things that we're doing here. Obviously with the social media censorship and all the rest of it, it's difficult to say how long they'll allow us to operate on this forum. So and this platform. So make sure you get behind the show now. If you like it, buy it. Make sure it comes your way whenever you see it. And we try to do the shows generally Fridays, and into the fall we'll be doing them Fridays at 8 p.m. So make sure you get behind the work that we're doing here. Okay, last couple of questions, Ms.
Okay,
Olivia.
Ed Kaufman. This has come up before, but I love this question. Richard Shaver of Ray Palmer sci-fi comic book fame. He talked about the underground, or the Deros, who Fred Krisman believed in as well. What do you have to say about it? I used to be very dubious about this, but I'm starting to believe.
It's really interesting, actually. Deros meant, I think, destructive robot. It was like shorthand. And it was for people who had been in these situations. They'd gone into combat in a place like Korea or somewhere, and they had seen these strange robots on the battlefield, or they had seen them in caves or underground. And so there was a collection of these stories. And there was something called the Shaver Mysteries, where they came up with this, and people would send in letters about it. And so it is a very unusual series of things. But one of the weird things is that Krisman, who is somebody who worked for Boeing and was known as a Boeing assassin, and they also say that he chased UFOs for a living. This is what he did, and that they made the series The Invaders about him. He was somebody that Jim Garrison, when he was investigating the Kennedy assassination, ran across and was like, oh, the aerospace companies have a series of assassins inside. So he's very close to X-Protect. He's right. The thing with the Garrison, I'm losing my voice a little bit.
I know it's not.
With the Garrison investigation, what happens is he gets into the heart of things that he didn't start out looking for. He gets into the center of the Nazi technology and the Nazi scientists, and he gets into the center of the aerospace wing of the military-industrial complex. When people look at, from the Kennedy assassination research, and when they look at the Garrison thing, they don't get that part of, it's basically, there's a large-scale UFO investigation right in the heart of the Garrison investigation. Gordon Novell, who shows up and betrays Garrison by pretending to be like a bug sweep guy who will help him prevent the CIA from sweeping bugs into his place and monitoring him. He ends up being the guy who electronically surveils him. And then his great thing is, a couple of decades later, his thing is like, let's get breakthrough energy from UFOs. So there's a UFO thing in the middle of all this. And Krisman is a big piece of that. Also, I'll say it's weird that Krisman used the pseudonym John Gold. I remember that about him. And that Krisman was one of the people involved in the original Maury Island UFO incidents. So you have a lot going on there. Yes.
It's derelict robots.
Derelict.
That's a great phrase.
The Deros.
Okay. I have to ask this question.
You know who's the master of that whole topic?
Who?
And he has that one fantastic book, Ken Thomas. And the book is JFK and UFO. There's your title.
There you go. So I have to ask this. Josh Rendar says, what do you think of Paul Hager's story of ETs disguised as nuns in Vegas? I don't know this story. Do you know this story? We have his book.
Well, I've interviewed Paul Hellyer.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that he's referencing the Tall Whites story. I'm trying to think of the Tall Whites guy. Now, he's referencing that story. I don't think that he witnessed this. Here's what...
You don't think they're traveling around disguised as nuns? That's how they...
Well, this is very interesting. Paul Hellyer, let's start with this. He was Defense Secretary of Canada, the Defense Minister of Canada. And what he found out when he was Defense Minister is that the governments, militaries of Canada and the United States had an agreement in relation to UFOs, and that agreement did not involve them telling the Prime Minister on one side or the President on the other. They would work it out among themselves. That's the first, I think, thing that opened his eyes about it. This is a guy who's in his 90s who can think circles around anybody. And we have a very interesting interview with him. I think it's 2016, though. So it's a few years ago. But boy, It's a real eye opener, and he also is somebody who tracks down the the Federal Reserve, and he's really good on the financial side. So he's a real political mover and shaker, but he's a former Canadian official who believes in the UFO file. And one of the stories that he's mentioned is this thing about in Las Vegas, these aliens who were walking around and hanging out in casinos and doing all this stuff, dressed up as nuns. And I think he gets that from the guy who wrote the Tall Whites book, who's Charles
Hall.
Charles Hall, yeah. Interesting guy, interesting story. Hard to prove, but wow. It's pretty good. When you think about this, I always think about Ingo Swann in relation to the alien part, because Swann is a very interesting guy because he did all the remote viewing. He was known as the top remote viewer in that program. Pat Price was the other one who was incredible, and he died young. Swann's not with us anymore, but one of the things that Swann said was that he'd learned to observe visitors here who looked like us, acted like us, because he was so telepathic, and so are they. And so once in a while, when he was in New York City or he was on a train or whatever, he would see one. And he got the impression to basically book it out of there and not try to interact with them. So this is a pretty interesting thing. One of the wild things too that you reminded me of talking about this is that Swann had this incident where he was doing a job for what he thought was the government, where they wanted him to remote view the moon. And when they said, let's meet at Penn Station in New York City, and he shows up there, and there are three homeless guys who really look down on their luck. But they very quickly stand up and sort of drape off the homeless stuff and walk with him to a car, give him a code or whatever. And he's off and away, and they're stripping off the homeless garb. This is very important. We have to remember that covert agencies operate in our midst all the time. So if thinking that aliens are there in our midst is too far for you, at least understand that the covert organizations studying these types of things are right in the warp and woof of your daily life. So it's definitely, there's always a world beneath the world that's happening. Okay, yes, Miss Olivia.
Hodl Crypto. Is Musk bringing the real Tesla tech to humanity? And Najat Madri, do you think if Trump's back is against the wall, he'll let it all out?
I like that last one. Trump has already let out a few things. When the F-35 and the X-35 planes became F-35, he said they're invisible, and everybody freaked out. And he said, no one will ever see them coming. It's because they possess invisibility technology. We've already seen them demonstrate it in a sense, visual invisibility. They literally can do this, but it's not official yet. Okay, so when he was saying it, he was letting it out because he wanted people to know, hey, I'm the guy who has the invisible technology. But that is X technology, and it partakes of that secrecy world. There's still that gigantic overhang. And instead, the media was like, oh, stupid Trump, is telling, God knows, the national security problems he caused by saying we had invisible technology. Trump is the kind of guy who doesn't think from a place of what's politically advantageous for me. He thinks of, what makes me feel good when I talk about my accomplishments. And so he has that quality to him. He never really got that political training, in a sense. CEOs tend to brag about things. They can keep secrets too, but it's a little different than a president. So I think with Trump, that aspect, when he was talking to his son about Roswell, that was one thing. And he said, there's a lot of very important things about it. That I found very interesting. The second thing that he said that was interesting was to Lou Dobbs, of all people. And at the end of this kind of wonky interview about all these policy positions, Lou Dobbs, of all people, on Fox Business says, I have friends and they want to know, what about aliens? What about Roswell and all that stuff? And Trump says, well, if there's any place that needs transparency, it's right there. That's a weird thing. That means that the Space Force and his leadership of the Space Force is to try to get the UFO file under the presidential wing. I don't think the UFO file is under the presidential wing, but I think that they have enough access to it that they think they can get the whole thing back. And I think it's a card in Trump's deck, for sure. All right. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Okay. I know I ask a lot of David Terminator's questions, but he has the best questions.
Hey.
Okay. DJ, Project Pluto took place in Area 25, very close to the property Hughes purchased in Nevada, and the grandson of the project director, Ted Merkel, was a chief executive at Alcor Life Extension.
Oh, wow. Well, John Mayer said that Hughes was fascinated with the cryogenics part, and that he asked him to investigate it. It's pretty interesting that you bring those pieces in together. One of the things I wanted to say in relation to this, you made me think of it, is Google, when they bought the Spruce Goose hangar in order to place YouTube production studios inside of it, they bought 12 acres right next to it. Then they go to Toronto and they buy something that's like a hangar, and they buy 12 acres right next to it. So there's something very interesting about this acre thing. I haven't figured it out. But the presence of this sacred geometry idea can't be left out, And so when I think about people owning buildings, and these buildings having headquarters, and Google buying the Spruce Goose headquarters and then 12 acres, it's almost like there's some pattern that they're following. So that's what instantly made that come to mind. Yes, Ms. Olivia.
Okay, I'm sorry to do it again. David Terminator. Lockheed Martin merged with a company who eventually became the owners of the Stargate file, remote viewing, the Leidos Corporation. Flying Memorials says Leidos is one of the few companies committed to Antarctica.
Oh,
there's some good stuff, juicy stuff to follow up on.
Yeah, fantastic. And I'll tell you an interesting thing, since you mentioned Stargates, is one of the documents that I found in relation to the CIA's Stargate program is that they listed Andros as the headquarters of the Stargate program. This is very interesting because the Stargate program is it's a psychic program. It involves remote viewing and all the rest.
I thought it was run out of Stanford.
Well, the program is, but the headquarters for the Stargate project is on Andros.
That's far.
Yeah, I have the documents, so it's not in question. It's on the CIA's website. But what we talk about in relation to the Andros thing is the Andros platform is on the other side of, that's in the whole Bimini thing, and we know that Autech inhabits. They do most of their experiments. They're right there at Andros. So this thing had a psychic part to it, the whole setup of Autech and all the rest of it, for the Stargate program to be at Andros. And then when we know everything about the hot zone, from Hemingway's spending the time there, to the incredible UFO activity, to the fact that Atlantis is rising there, according to Edgar Casey, and that's how the Hemingways knew. I mean, this is all in my Hemingway Hot Zone episodes. But then there's the Cuban City and Polina Zalitsky. All that is right there. And then right in the heart of it is the CIA running the Stargate program at Andros Island. So, I mean, what do you do with information like that? Those are pretty amazing dots sitting right there. It tells you there's a lot going on in that hot zone. That's why it's called the hot zone unofficially. Yes.
Since you brought up Casey, David Donaway said, is Elon Musk a front to build tunnels to survive the Casey predicted pole shift?
I think that the Earth changes aspects of the Casey readings is sorely missing from the discussion now, maybe because people overplayed things like Y2K 2000 and 2012, so that they forgot that the Earth changes were something that Casey said, look, this area is going to rise up where Atlantis was off the east coast of America. And people bought lots there. Somebody, before we started the show, suggested offering lots in the Atlantic Ocean by Bitcoin. That was pretty funny. But this is very fascinating, because when you think about how would you survive a pole shift, you would need facilities, and maybe those facilities would be underground, a la like the mound builders, for example. There's some suggestion that the mound builders were protecting themselves from the sun. So, we have to keep these things in mind, the massive tunnel structures that are underneath Turkey and Syria. Why are they there? That's way before you had boring technology. And why did they bury Göbekli Tepe? This is the oldest, right? Megalith site, 11,000, 12,000 years ago. Why is it buried? And it was intentionally buried, and just, we're going to leave it that way. So these are the things I think that we have to consider. When you look at Casey's outlook on this, remember that at one point he said that he had a dream that Nebraska was on the coast. Think about that. I know it's not pleasant to think about, but he predicted the destruction of Los Angeles, San Francisco, and he also said that Georgia and the Maine would disappear. And he also said, watch the upper East Coast. It's kind of interesting. And Manhattan in the Maine would disappear. Although later he went back and said that in 2100, looking around there at New York, that was another different kind of experience, like a dream experience. And he asked one of the hard hats there where he was, and they said, you're in New York. And he said it had been destroyed either by earthquake or war. He couldn't figure out which. So these are all possible futures. I'm not a doomsday person, but I do think that we've seen with incredible weather patterns, massive earthquakes, we could see inundations. It's possible. It's certainly possible. These structures, one of the things that Musk has said his life goal is making sure that humanity survives, which is why he wants a Mars colony. So why would you think humanity wouldn't survive? So it opens up your question a great deal. And with that, I think we have arrived at the nexus of this episode. And I want to remind everyone, go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter, and make sure that you're counted. Get on board. We have incredible announcements coming up. Someone just said something about Livingston, Montana would someday feed the world. Casey did say that. He also said that South Africa, Livingston, Montana, and parts of Canada and Saskatchewan would become major food centers that would become the food hub for the world. He also mentioned that Pampas region in Argentina. So it makes you wonder why there's so many former Nazis down there. Mm-hmm. What do they know? Very interesting stuff. And it's incredible as we rocket through. There's one part I didn't get to tonight, which I'll show, which is this picture of Ronald Reagan with Paul Laxalt. And Paul Laxalt was one of those major figures like Richard Nixon that Hughes was trying to prop up to be his main man. And he got to governorship, but he never made it to president. But that's what Hughes wanted for him. But he was somebody who we'll get into at some point. Laxalt was quite fascinating. And when you get around Star Wars and the SDI program, you're dealing straight out of Nevada. And that means that whole close relationship of Reagan with Laxalt comes right into the fore. So we're going to tackle them at some point. One of the things I want to have you take away from this episode is that when we look at Hughes' activity in the Spruce Goose and the McMinnville UFO, and then the presence of Google taking over the hangar, we've seen the direct lineage of the X technology. They've represented it. And so when you have SpaceX and they're going underground in Las Vegas, that's very significant stuff, and that they're being helped in that effort by the Howard Hughes Corporation, as we showed here earlier tonight. These are the things that help us to know that that covert development, that black project aerospace development, and that hidden technology, which has that X steganography as the heart of its kind of symbolic representation, it is so active. It's like this is the point they're reaching up to. And, you know, we've talked about people like Casey and Steiner talking about there's a period that we're entering, which is a kind of fulfillment where we have to face this. And this is what I think the information in this program can help us to do. So that's the kind of stuff that we're trying to deliver for you guys. And I do think, though, it requires some very, very deep contemplation around SpaceX and Musk and Hughes and Google. It lets us know that we're very close to that very important precipice.
And if people want to take a look at that, at the Google headquarters.
No, it's not open to the public.
No, but online, because the pictures are so amazing.
Yeah, well, it's Google Spruce.
Okay.
Yeah, it'll get you right there. You can search for it there. I've put some of the pictures up, and I'll put more up on Twitter. But there's no question about it. It is remarkable. It is weird, though. I thought you were going to say, can you just walk in there? I found out that you can't. I think that's pretty interesting.
I'm sure it's very secure, right? Do they do tours at all?
It seemed to me it was off limits to anyone except for employees and their guests.
It's massive. That's the thing. It's not only just gorgeous, what a wonderful place to work, right? Just incredibly cool, but it's just so big. Yeah.
I know, absolutely remarkable. And I also think that there's something when you really look at Teller and Google, and, there's a weird kind of algorithmic test in relation to space that is going on as part of Moonshot, which is why I think it's called Moonshot. And that's going to come in close here on the space side as we get along with this. So we'll be taking you deep on this. We'll be back with you next week on Friday. And what have you got?
I have to thank some super chatters.
Yes, please.
Okay, Roman Hansen, Irie A, Eurythmy is Fun, Donald Harris, Bill Gometz, a cult fan, Maggie Smith, and GDNPB. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. We really appreciate your support of the show. To our subscribers, I really, really appreciate you keeping us going. I want to say a few shout outs there. Breach, it's great to see you out there. Lee, of course, the man, the myth. Matt Jonas, great to see you. A cult fan, terrific. I know Carly was out there earlier. Najat, it's terrific to see you. Deborah Sloan and Deborah Blair was out there earlier. Thank you so much for being with us. Kate, great to see you. Josh Randall, Esoteric 369. Wall. Wow, it's fantastic to have you out tonight. Fantastic group in the ideas room. I think you got them going. You got it. You made it happen as usual. I also want to mention that Olivia's Twitter has been on fire lately with all the great things you've been putting out.
I know people are shocked. I'm a very different person on Twitter.
Well,
I'm much more radicalized.
You're radicalized. No, you're just very straightforward, which I appreciate. But
I'm very passionate.
Those are terrific threads. Really great. So I highly recommend that. At Olivia Wingsgirl on Twitter. Of course, we're at Dark Journalist on Twitter. And Aether, it's great to see you out there. Marco, Enki.
You better thank David. He's waiting for
David Tormina. David does great open source research around all these topics. He's always coming up with very interesting things on Twitter. So you can just, log in and follow him on Twitter. And that's great stuff. You just want to engage in the conversation.
David has some kind of a psychic link with the show.
Yes. Oh, I agree. I agree with that. And Maggie Smith. Wow, terrific to see you. So many great people and questions tonight. Of course, you guys will all be on board with us next week on Friday. We will see you. And, it's end broadcast, but, it doesn't really end. And have a great weekend. Don't let the crazy
Right.
political atmosphere.
This is a very intense astrological weekend.
Yes.
So take it easy, everybody.
Good point.
Yeah.
Well, we'll probably get an astrologer on for that one.
Mhm.
Coming up. We have to be on top of those for sure. Bo Krills, it's great to see you, sir.
Hey, baby.
BB Plug, there she is. How's it going out there? Josh, Scarlett, Christine Taggart. Wow, great people out there tonight. We will catch you all next week and have a great night.
Have a wonderful week.
Nicely done, Miss Olivia. Bravo. Round of applause. Good night, everyone.
Good night.